Martha Whitaker pressed her last $11 against her chest and walked out of that boarding house without looking back. Not because she wasn't hurt, but because she had learned early and hard that crying in front of people only gave them something else to mock. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel right now and follow Maddie's journey all the way to the end. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The summer of 1879 arrived in Dry Creek, Arizona territory, the way all cruel things arrive without warning and without mercy. The heat came first. It pressed down on the town like a hand flat against a stove, drawing the moisture from the earth, cracking the lips of men who worked outdoors, wilting the few flowers that the women of Dry Creek still bothered to plant along their porch rails. By the middle of June, the creek that gave the town its name had already dropped 3 inches. By the end of the month, folks were beginning to say it might dry altogether before August. Martha Whitaker had arrived in Dry Creek on a Tuesday morning, carrying everything she owned in a single carpet bag and a sewing kit wrapped in oilcloth. She had $42 when she left her sister's house in New Mexico territory. She had 11 by the time the stagecoach deposited her in front of Hargrove's boarding house with its peeling white paint and its hand-lettered sign that said, "Clean rooms, decent meals, respectable tenants only." She should have noticed the emphasis on that last part. She noticed it 36 hours later. Mrs. Ida Hargrove was a woman built like a fence post, thin, rigid, and inclined toward judgment. She had rented Martha a room on the 2nd floor with a view of the alley, charged her $4 for 2 nights in advance, and served her supper without comment. Martha had been grateful. She had smiled. She had said thank you and meant it. But on Wednesday morning, when Martha came downstairs with her carpet bag already packed, because she'd heard of a seamstress position over on Miller Street, and wanted to arrive early, she found Mrs. Hargrove waiting in the front parlor, with 2 other women flanking her like deputies. 3 men sat in the corner with their coffee, not pretending to mind their own business. "Miss Whitaker," Mrs. Hargrove said, and her voice had that particular quality that school teachers use when they've already made up their minds. "I'm afraid this establishment is not suited to your situation." Martha stopped on the second-to-last stair. "My situation." "Your size, dear." Mrs. Hargrove said it the way she might have said the weather plainly and without apology. "My chairs are not built for a woman of your proportions." And the other tenants have expressed concern. One of the flanking women, the younger one with the yellow bonnet, pressed her lips together against a smile she wasn't quite managing to hide. Martha felt her face go hot. She felt every inch of herself, every curve, every pound, suddenly monstrous and public, as if Mrs. Hargrove had reached across the room and stripped something away from her that she hadn't even known she was still holding on to. "I see," Martha said. Her voice came out steady. She couldn't explain why. Steadiness was the only pride she had left. "It's nothing personal," Mrs. Hargrove added as if that made it medicine instead of poison. "But no decent cowboy's going to call on a woman built like a flour barrel, and I run a respectable house. The other ladies here have prospects. It wouldn't be fair to them." One of the men in the corner laughed. Not loudly. Just enough. Martha came down the last 2 stairs. She crossed the room to Mrs. Hargrove, and she held out her hand. "My $2 back, if you please. I've only slept 1 night." Mrs. Hargrove blinked. She had expected tears apparently, or argument, or the particular kind of crumbling that women like Martha were supposed to do when women like Ida Hargrove reminded them of their place. She had not expected an open hand and a level gaze. She gave back $1.50. Martha took it without comment. She walked out the front door without looking at the men in the corner. She walked down the 2 steps to the dirt street, and she kept walking until she had turned the corner and was out of sight of the boarding house windows. Then she stopped. She stood in the thin morning shadow of a dry goods store, pressed her back against the wall, and breathed. She pressed the $1.50 and the $11 against her sternum, hard feeling the edges of the coins through her dress. She did not cry. She had made a rule about that somewhere around the age of 14, when she'd first understood that her body was going to be the thing that people noticed before they noticed anything else about her. Crying only proved them right, proved that she was soft, proved that she was weak, proved that she was as pitiable as they seemed to need her to be. She breathed. She let the heat press down on her. She looked at the sky, which was the particular pale white blue of a sky that has been drained of every cloud, and she tried to think practically. $11.50. No room. No job yet. Heat rising already, and it wasn't even 8 in the morning. She pushed herself off the wall and walked to the train platform at the edge of town, because the train platform had a bench and a roof, and she needed somewhere to sit and think that wasn't the middle of a dirt street. The platform was quiet at that hour. A freight wagon was being unloaded at the far end. A boy sat on a barrel eating something wrapped in paper. A station master moved behind the window glass like a fish in a murky tank. Martha sat on the bench. She set her carpet bag at her feet. She opened her sewing kit, out of habit, checked the needles, counted her thread, closed it again. It was something her hands needed to do when her mind was trying to outrun panic. That was when she saw the notice. It was nailed to the post at the edge of the platform roof. One of 6 or 7 papers pinned there, among announcements for auctions and church socials, and a reward for a missing mule. This one was written in plain block letters, someone's careful hand, not a printer's type. Widowed rancher seeks summer help. 3 children. Cook and housekeeper. Room and board provided. Fair wages. Inquire Caleb Rowan Ranch, 7 miles east on the Copper Road. Martha read it twice. She looked at the date at the bottom, 3 days ago. She sat with it for a moment. She knew what that notice likely meant in practical terms: hard work in hard heat for wages that were probably less than the notice made them sound. She knew that ranch work for a housekeeper was not the seamstress position she'd been hoping for. She knew that 7 miles east on the Copper Road was 7 miles east of the town that had just handed her back $1.50 instead of $2, and told her she was shaped wrong. She unpinned the notice from the post. She folded it. She put it in her apron pocket. Then she stood up, picked up her carpet bag, and walked to the livery to ask about the cheapest way to get 7 miles east on the Copper Road. The wagon ride cost her 30 cents, hitched with a hay delivery that was going out that direction anyway. The driver was a weathered man of about 60, who said nothing to her except the price and a grunt when she climbed up, which Martha considered the finest conversation she'd had since arriving in Dry Creek. She saw the Rowan Ranch from a quarter-mile out. The land was flat here, spreading in every direction under that pale, hammered sky, and the ranch buildings sat low against it. A main house, a barn, a smaller outbuilding, a fenced pasture where a few cattle stood in the shade of a single tree. The garden to the south of the house was clearly dead, the plants brown and collapsed against their stakes, nothing moving in them. The gate was open. As the wagon slowed at the turn, Martha saw that she was not the first woman to come about the notice. 3 of them stood in the yard near the porch, all of them younger than Martha, all of them in cleaner dresses, 2 of them with parasols against the sun. They were talking among themselves, and not Martha could tell from 40 feet away, saying anything kind. One of them was laughing behind her hand. Another was pointedly examining the state of the porch railing. The third was fanning herself and looking toward the road, as if already calculating the distance back to civilization. And then there was the man. He stood on the porch, not leaning, not slouching, just standing the way men stand when they've spent years outdoors, and the habit of stillness has gotten into their bones. Tall, broad across the shoulders, a dark brown hat pushed back on his head. He was watching the 3 women in his yard with an expression Martha couldn't read at that distance, but it wasn't the expression of a man who was pleased with what he was seeing. Martha climbed down from the wagon before it had fully stopped, caught the sack with her heel, almost went sideways, caught herself on the sideboard with both hands. Not graceful. Not the entrance she might have chosen. She straightened up, settled her bonnet, picked up her carpet bag, and walked through the gate. The 3 women noticed her before the man did. Martha saw it happen. The small group shift, the sideways looks exchange, the particular quality of attention that a certain kind of woman turns on another woman she has already dismissed. The one with the parasol said something behind her hand that made the other 2 smile. Martha kept walking. As she came closer, she heard the tail end of what the man was saying to the 3 women, his voice flat and tired. "Appreciate you coming out, but if you're not willing to sleep in the house and take the night work when Grace needs it, then I don't think we're a match." "Night work," said the woman with the parasol, and the way she said it made clear she'd decided the entire enterprise was beneath her. "Mr. Rowan, I came out here expecting a manageable domestic position, not a—" She glanced toward the house, toward the windows. Something moved behind one of them. "I have my own reputation to consider." "Then I'm glad we've settled it," the man said. The parasol woman turned away from him and nearly walked into Martha. She pulled up short. Her eyes went down Martha's body and up again in that fast, practiced way that managed to communicate everything without saying a word. She stepped around Martha as if stepping around a cart in the road, and the other two followed her, and all three of them walked back toward the gate without looking back. Martha heard one of them say just loud enough, "Well, if that's what he's reduced to." She didn't hear the rest. She was already looking at the man on the porch. He was looking at her too. He had dark eyes she couldn't tell the color at this distance, and a short, uneven beard that was growing in without much attention being paid to it. He looked the way men look when they haven't slept well in a long time. Not slovenly, just worn through. "I'm here about the notice," Martha said. "Housekeeper and cook, summer help." He said nothing for a moment. She felt his eyes on her. Not in the way Mrs. Hargrove's eyes had been. Not leering, not mocking, just reading. The way you'd read a letter you weren't sure you understood yet. "Notice has been up 3 days," he said. "I saw it this morning. You're not from Dry Creek. I came in yesterday from New Mexico territory." She didn't say from where she'd spent last night, and she didn't say why she'd left. "I'm looking for work. I can cook, clean, mend, and tend to children. I've done all 4 before." She paused. "I don't have references from this county. I can give you a name in Santa Fe if you'd like to write a letter, but I understand if you need someone sooner." He looked at her for another moment. "You know it's 7 miles from town," he said. "You'd be out here all week. Wouldn't get back to Dry Creek except on Sundays if you wanted." "I don't have strong feelings about Dry Creek," Martha said. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. More like the acknowledgement that a thing had been said that was worth hearing. "The work is hard," he said. "The heat this summer is bad. The children are—" He stopped, started again. "They're good children. But it's been a hard year. Most years are," Martha said. He came down the porch steps then. 2 steps and he was on the ground level with her. He was taller than she'd guessed. He looked at her directly without embarrassment, the way a man looks when he's not playing a game. "I'll be plain with you, ma'am," he said. "I've had 3 women out here today. 2 said the house was too rough. 1 said the children were too much. I need someone who can feed 3 kids through the summer, keep the house from falling down around us, and be here when I'm out working the pasture." He paused. "Can you do that?" Martha felt her hands tighten around the handle of her carpet bag. She felt the heat on the back of her neck. She thought about Mrs. Hargrove, about the $1.50, about the 3 women who had just walked back through that gate. "Mr. Rowan," she said, "I may not be fit for any man, but I can feed hungry children, cool a fever, mend torn clothes, and stay when others leave." He was quiet for long enough that she thought she'd lost it, that something in the words or the way she'd said them had been wrong. Then he said, "My name is Caleb Rowan. The children are Annie, Ben, and Grace. Annie is 9, Ben is 6, Grace is 4. He tilted his hat back slightly. "Wages are $8 a month. Room is in the house off the kitchen. Board is whatever's on the table." He extended his hand. "You'll want to know what you're agreeing to before you say yes." Martha shifted the carpet bag to her left hand and shook his hand with her right. His grip was firm. Not the grip of a man trying to impress, just the grip of a man who shook hands meaning it. "Martha Whitaker," she said. "I go by Maddie." "Miss Maddie," he said. Then he turned toward the porch. "Come on then. They've been watching from the window since you walked through the gate." Yag. She heard the children before she saw them. There was a small sound, quick the sound of feet on floorboards, and then the creak of the front door, and then a small body appeared in the doorway pressed against the frame. 9 years old, thin and watchful, with her father's dark eyes, and a braid that had been tied and retied until it was mostly coming loose. "Are you the new one?" the girl said. Flat. Measuring. "This is Annie," Caleb said from behind Martha. "Annie, this is Miss Maddie. She's going to be helping us for the summer." "The last 2 didn't stay," Annie said. She was looking at Martha the way a very old woman looks at a thing she's been disappointed by before. I noticed, Martha said. You're fat, Annie said. Annie. Caleb's voice carried a warning. It ain't an insult, Annie said, still watching Martha. I'm just saying. Mrs. Hargrove told Pa you'd probably be by because you didn't have anywhere else to go. She said. She stopped. Something crossed her face. She said some things. Martha looked at the girl for a moment. She thought about how to answer. She thought about how adults usually answered with corrections or redirections, or the particular cheerful dishonesty that is supposed to protect children from ugly facts. She decided against it. Mrs. Hargrove is right that I needed work, Martha said. But I'm not here because I had nowhere else. I'm here because I saw your father's notice and I can do the job. Those are two different things. Annie looked at her for another long moment. Then she stepped back from the door. Ben's in the kitchen. He won't come out when there's strangers, but he'll come out when he smells something cooking. She paused. Grace is behind the settle. She does that when she's scared. Thank you for telling me, Martha said. She stepped through the door. The inside of the house told her everything she needed to know, and then a little more. The kitchen was the worst of it. Dishes she didn't look too long at. The table had a ring from a pot set down wet and never wiped. The window over the sink had a crack running through the lower glass that someone had stuffed with a rag from the inside. The floor near the stove had gone gray-black with grease worked into the grain of the wood. A small boy sat in the far corner of the kitchen on an overturned crate watching her. Ben. Dark hair like his sister. Smaller than she'd expected for 6. He had his knees pulled up and his arms wrapped around them, and he watched her come through the doorway without moving, without speaking, without anything that she could call expression. She looked at him. She didn't try to cross to him or smile in the way that people smile at children they don't know, and that children always see through. I'm Maddie, she said. I'm going to get this kitchen in order. I'm not going to bother you while I do it. He didn't speak. She put her carpet bag by the kitchen door and rolled up her sleeves. She heard from behind the large wooden settle in the front room the smallest possible sound a breath caught and held. Grace. She didn't go to her. She turned to the pump at the sink, tested it, found it working, and started to do the dishes. The settle in the front room faced the doorway to the kitchen, and so Grace, pressed into the corner behind it, could see Martha working without being seen. Martha knew this. She let it be. She washed dishes for 20 minutes. The water went black with old grease. She pumped fresh water, worked the bar of lye soap down to a sliver, dried each dish on a rag she found hung over the pump handle. She stacked them. She scrubbed the pot. She left the window rag where it was because that was a later problem. At some point, without announcing it, Ben moved from his crate to the kitchen table. He didn't say anything. He just sat down and watched her work. She didn't make a thing of it. You know where your father keeps the flour? She asked, not looking at him. A pause. Then pantry. Cornmeal. Same place. Salt pork. Cellar. Thank you. She opened the pantry. The flour was there, a good amount of it, which was something. She found cornmeal, dried beans, some onions that were starting to soften but weren't gone yet. She looked at what was available and calculated what she could make with it tonight, tomorrow morning, and tomorrow evening. You like cornbread? She asked. Ben considered this seriously. With beans. Good, me too. She heard the settle move in the front room. She didn't look. She started the fire in the stove. By the time Caleb came in from the barn at 6 o'clock, the kitchen smelled of cooking beans and warm cornbread and something else, something harder to name. The kind of smell a house gets when there is activity in it, when it is being used instead of merely survived in. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. Ben was at the table talking, actually, talking in the low, careful way of a boy who is still learning to trust his own voice again, while Maddie stood at the stove with her back to the room, stirring something in the pot. Annie was sitting across from Ben, and she had her arms folded and her chin up the way she sat when she was listening harder than she wanted anyone to know she was listening. And on the bench beside the table, her small body pressed against Maddie's discarded apron like it was a shore she'd washed up on, was Grace, asleep, with one fist closed around the edge of the apron's fabric. Caleb looked at that. He looked at it for a long moment. He looked at his youngest daughter, who had not willingly sat in the same room as an adult she didn't know since the funeral, who had spent the last 6 months pressing herself into corners and behind furniture and against walls as if she was trying to take up as little space in the world as possible because the world had already taken so much from her. Asleep, on a bench, with her hand in a stranger's apron. Maddie turned from the stove and saw him. She glanced at Grace. She didn't say anything. She just turned back to the pot. Caleb hung his hat on the hook by the door. He sat down at the table. He said, "Smells good?" "Beans'll be ready in 10 minutes, Maddie said. "Cornbread's done." "Pa," Ben said, as if reminding himself his father was there. "Maddie knows how to cook beans right. She puts onion in." "Does she?" Caleb said. "And she doesn't put too much salt. Mama used to put too much salt." Ben's voice went small and careful around the word mama, the way a person walks carefully around a loose board they've found in a floor. "I liked Mama's beans, but Maddie's are good too." Caleb looked at Maddie's back. "Good to know," he said quietly. Maddie did not turn around, but he saw her shoulders settle just slightly. The way shoulders settle when something has been said that makes the room feel less like a place you have to guard yourself in. After supper, beans and cornbread, and a pitcher of water that Maddie had put a sprig of dried mint in because she'd found it in the pantry, and mint in water was something she believed in. Grace woke up from her nap on the bench. She woke the way very small children wake when they're not sure where they are. Eyes open, body still looking at everything around her with that particular 4-year-old assessment that is entirely without social grace. She looked at Maddie. Maddie was washing the supper dishes. She didn't look back. Grace slid off the bench, crossed the floor in her bare feet, which were silent on the boards. And then, without saying anything, without being invited, she pressed herself against Maddie's side, her face against Maddie's hip, through the dusty blue dress, her small arms wrapped around as much as they could reach. Maddie's hands went still in the wash water. She didn't reach down immediately. She let a breath pass. Then, very slowly, she dried one hand on her apron and rested it on the top of Grace's head. "Hello," Maddie said. "Hello," Grace said from somewhere in the fabric of Maddie's dress. Caleb, at the table with his coffee, watched this. Annie, who had been pretending to read in the front room and was absolutely not pretending to read, lowered her book by half an inch. Ben, who had gone out to help his father check on the livestock, was not there to see it. But Annie told him later in a whisper while they were supposed to be sleeping, and Ben said nothing for a long moment, and then said, "Good." That first night after the children were in bed, Maddie stood on the porch in the last gray light and looked at the dead garden. She could feel the heat still radiating up from the ground, stored there through the whole baking day. The sky had gone deep purple at the horizon. Somewhere out past the barn, a coyote was complaining about something. She heard the door open behind her. Caleb came out and stood beside her, not too close. He looked at the garden. "My wife's," he said. "She planted it. I didn't know what to do with it after." A pause. "I didn't know what to do with a lot of things after." "What did she grow?" Maddie asked. "Beans, squash, tomatoes." She had a row of sunflowers along the fence. He was quiet. The children watered them for a while. Then they stopped. Maddie looked at the dead stalks. The ones along the fence were still upright, brittle, and brown, the seed heads hanging empty. "Sunflowers will come back," she said, "if you start them right." He looked at her. "Not these plants," she added. "These are finished, but the seeds are probably still in the ground. They'll come back if the soil gets worked and the water comes regular." She paused. "Things are harder to kill than they look sometimes." He didn't say anything to that. She went back inside to lay out her bedroll in the room off the kitchen. She found when she got there that someone had put a folded quilt on the foot of the narrow bed. It was the kind of quilt that takes a long time to make. She could see in the low lamplight that some of the fabric pieces were printed with small flowers. She unfolded it. She spread it on the bed. She did not think about who had made it. She laid down and listened to the coyote outside and the small sounds of the children in their rooms and the house settling around her in the heat, and she thought that this was the first time since she'd left New Mexico that she hadn't counted the coins in her pocket to get to sleep. The town was already talking by Thursday. Martha had been at the Rowan Ranch for 2 days. Word travels fast in small places, and Dry Creek was nothing if not small. By the time she went with Caleb to the general store on Friday morning to buy flour and salt pork and a new bar of soap, 3 women on the porch of the hardware store across the street had turned to watch. One of them said something. One of them laughed. The third one, older, with a dark bonnet, looked away. Martha had learned to identify the categories. There were the ones who said things, the ones who laughed, and the ones who looked away. She had never been sure which category she minded more. In the general store, she stood at the counter beside Caleb and gave the list to Mr. Fenwick. The storekeeper, a man with careful eyes, who had probably served every kind of person in 30 years of keeping the store and had learned to give nothing away. He took the list. He looked at Martha. "You're the new help out at Rowan's place," he said, not unfriendly, just naming it. "Yes, sir," Martha said. "From back east, New Mexico territory." He looked at the list. He started pulling things from the shelves. "How are the children?" Martha glanced at Caleb. He was looking at a display of axle grease and not appearing to listen. "Working through things," Martha said. Fenwick nodded. He set a sack of flour on the counter. "Caleb's a good man," he said quietly enough that it felt like it wasn't for general circulation. "He's had a hard go." "I know it," Martha said. "Summer's going to be hard on the stock. Creek's dropping fast." "Yes, sir." He set the rest of the supplies on the counter, tallied them up in pencil on the edge of a brown paper bag. He named the price to Caleb, who paid it. Then, as Martha was picking up the parcels, Fenwick said without quite looking at her, "Nice to have that house smelling like bread again, I expect." Martha looked at him. He was already turning to the next customer. She picked up the parcels and carried them out to the wagon. Well, it was that afternoon that she first heard the name Silas Crow. She was out back of the house hanging the laundry, the children's things which she had washed and wrung in the morning, when she heard 2 voices on the far side of the fence that divided the Rowan property from the road. She didn't stop working. She just listened the way women learn to listen when they understand that the conversations happening on the other side of fences are often the ones that concern them most directly. 2 men. One she didn't know. One was doing most of the talking. "Crow's been wanting that spring for 3 years. He figures now that the ranch is struggling, Rowan'll sell." "Rowan ain't the selling kind." "He ain't, but if his situation gets bad enough, if the county gets involved, if there's questions about the children's welfare, he might not have a choice." A pause. "Crow's already made some inquiries with the circuit judge." "About what?" "About a widower leaving 3 young children in the care of some woman he brought out of nowhere. Some big woman, nobody knows her from anywhere. No family, no standing." The first voice went quiet for a moment. Then, "That ain't right." "Ain't have to be right," the second voice said. "Just has to stick long enough." They moved on down the road. Martha stood with a wet sheet in her hands and the sun beating down on her shoulders, and she watched them go. 2 men on horseback, easy in their saddles, carrying a plan that would destroy everything she'd spent 2 weeks building without a second thought. She hung the sheet. She hung the rest of the laundry. Then she went back into the kitchen and put a new batch of cornbread in the oven, because there were 3 children who needed to eat supper, and the laundry needed to finish drying, and the chickens needed water, and if she stopped to feel afraid, none of those things would happen. She did not say anything to Caleb that evening, but she looked at the 3 children around the table. Annie with her careful eyes. Ben eating with real appetite for the first time since she'd arrived. Grace with a smear of cornbread crumbs on her chin, trying to tell a story about a chicken that she'd seen do something funny that afternoon, and she thought, not yet. She was not going to let Silas Crow win before he'd even tried. She looked at Grace's smeared chin. She reached across and wiped it gently with the corner of her apron. Grace beamed at her. "Mama, Mattie." Grace said, still grinning the way 4-year-olds say things without calculation, without the self-consciousness that would come later, without understanding what they've just laid down. The table went quiet. Annie stared. Ben's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. Caleb, at the head of the table, went very still. Martha's throat closed around something she couldn't name. She kept her face easy. She kept her hand on Grace's chin for just a moment longer. "Eat your supper, sweetheart," she said steadily. Grace ate her supper. Under the table, Caleb's hand had closed around the edge of the bench. Martha did not look at him. But she knew the way you know things in rooms where no one is saying the important thing out loud, that something had shifted some plate deep below the surface of both of them, and nothing in the house was going to be entirely the same as it had been before. That small 4-year-old girl had spoken without knowing what she was saying. The coyote outside called again in the falling dark. The children finished their supper. Martha got up to clear the dishes. And somewhere out on the Copper Road, Silas Crow was already building the case that she didn't belong here. He was wrong about that. She just didn't know yet how she was going to prove it. Caleb said nothing at the breakfast table the morning after Grace had called her that. He ate. He drank his coffee. He pushed back his chair and went out to the barn before the children had finished their eggs, which was not unusual. He was always the first one out in the morning. But Martha noticed that he had not quite looked at her the whole meal. Not in the way of a man who was angry, in the way of a man who was looking at something in his own mind and finding it complicated. She let it be. She had learned in her 29 years that the worst thing you could do with a man who was thinking hard was to make him feel like he needed to stop thinking and explain himself. It never helped. It just pushed the thinking underground, where it did its work in the dark and came out sideways later. So she let him go. She fed the children. She sent Annie out to collect eggs. She taught Ben how to sweep the kitchen floor properly, not just pushing the dirt from one side to the other, but actually getting into the corners, which were the places dirt went to hide and wait. Ben took this instruction seriously, which was the thing about Ben that she was beginning to love the most. He took everything seriously. He treated sweeping the way he treated everything else, with a 6-year-old's complete and undivided gravity, and he swept that kitchen floor as if the future of the ranch depended on it. "You missed a spot," Grace said from her chair at the table, pointing. Ben swept the spot without comment. "You missed another one," Grace said. "Grace," Martha said, not looking up from the dough she was working. "If you're going to supervise, you have to do it right. You can't point at mistakes without also saying what's going right." Grace considered this. "He's doing good on the part near the stove," she offered. "There you go," Martha said. Ben swept the corner by the door with extra care. It was a small moment. It was the kind of small moment that doesn't seem like anything when you're inside it. Martha would think about it later, would think about all of the small moments stacked together like stones in a wall, each one ordinary, each one necessary. The whole thing becoming something that neither she nor the children had planned, and none of them could have predicted, and all of them had needed more than they knew. But that was later. That morning she made bread. She sent the children out into the yard to play in what little shade the barn cast. She went to look at the garden. She stood in front of it with her hands on her hips. The dead plants had to come out first. That was the beginning of everything. You had to take out what was dead before you could put in what was alive. She went to the small tool shed at the back of the house and found a spade that needed sharpening, and a hand fork, and a pair of gloves that had been left to stiffen in the heat. She pulled the gloves on, worked her fingers until they gave, and went back to the garden. She worked for 2 hours. She pulled the dead squash plants and the collapsed bean vines and the tomato stalks that had dried to sticks. She turned the soil with the spade, working up from the bottom where it was still dark and Liv breaking the crust that the sun had put on the top. She found worms, which was a good sign. She found the dried black seed heads of the sunflowers along the fence, and she went along the row and pressed each one, and some of them broke open in her fingers with seeds still inside. She saved the seeds. She was on her knees in the dirt, working compost from the pile at the back of the shed into the turned soil, when she heard boots on the ground behind her. She didn't turn. "Seeds are still good in the sunflowers," she said. A pause. Then Caleb said, "That right. Some of them. Enough." She pressed a handful of dark soil between her palms. If I start them this week, they'll be up before the worst of the heat. He came and crouched beside her, not helping, just looking at the soil, at the turned rows, at the seed heads she'd laid along the fence post in a careful line. I should have done this, he said. You had other things to do. She loved this garden. I know. Martha sat back on her heels. The children told me. Annie told me about the tomatoes. Ben said she grew sweet corn one year. He was quiet. The children talk about her, Martha said carefully. When they do, I let them. I don't redirect them or change the subject. She looked at him. I want you to know that. He met her eyes. Something in his face shifted, not broke, not softened exactly, but shifted. Like a door that has been locked so long, the hinges are stiff, not fully opening, but moving. Thank you, he said. It was the first time he had said that to her. She nodded and went back to the compost. He stayed crouched beside her for another minute, not saying anything, and then he stood and went back to the barn. On Saturday, 3 things happened. The first thing was that a woman named Mrs. Delia Foss came out from Dry Creek in a buggy with her husband driving, and she brought a pie. She was maybe 50 with a round face and quick eyes, and she handed the pie to Martha at the kitchen door and said in the manner of a woman delivering intelligence along with a baked good people are talking. I expect they are, Martha said. Not all of it bad, Mrs. Foss said, lowering her voice, as if the yard might be listening, which in a town like Dry Creek was not entirely paranoid. Fenwick told his wife you seemed solid. Clara Hennessy, that's the school teacher she's been asking after Annie, says she heard Annie's been coming back to herself. She looked at Martha with those quick eyes. That's your doing. Annie's doing, Martha said. Mrs. Foss looked at her for a moment. You're not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? Honestly, I expected someone desperate, someone who'd take any job out of nowhere to have a roof. She paused. I see you're that, but I also see you're something else. Martha held the pie. I appreciate the pie, Mrs. Foss. The older woman nodded. She reached into her bag and pressed something else into Martha's free hand, a small brown paper parcel. Seeds, she said. Sweet pepper and some tomato. From my own garden. I start them in June. They'll still give you something by August. She glanced past Martha at the house. Take care of those children. I intend to, Martha said. The buggy drove away. The second thing was that Annie came to her in the afternoon while Martha was hanging fresh laundry and said without preamble, I know why you didn't have references. Martha kept hanging. Is that right? You didn't have anyone to write for you. You'd left wherever you were, and you came here, and you didn't have anyone. Annie was standing just behind her, slightly to the left. She had a way of positioning herself that was not quite confrontational, but was not quite casual either. I do that too, Annie said more quietly. I talk like I know everything, because if I talk first, nobody can say something bad before I'm ready. Martha stopped hanging. She turned and looked at the girl. Annie's chin was up. Her arms were folded. She was 9 years old, and she had the face of someone who had decided that she would not be blindsided ever again by anything if she could help it. That's a hard way to live, Martha said. You do it too, Annie said. Martha looked at her. You looked right at Mrs. Hargrove's women when they walked by the gate, Annie said. I watched from the window. You looked at them straight the whole time, like you were daring them to say it. She met Martha's eyes. You've been saying things first your whole life, ain't you? Martha stood there in the afternoon heat. Yes, she said. Annie unfolded her arms. She picked up a wet shirt from the laundry basket and handed it to Martha without saying another word. They finished the laundry together. The third thing that happened on Saturday was that a man came to the gate on horseback at dusk. Martha was inside starting supper when she heard the hoofbeats, and then she heard Caleb's voice in the yard, and then another voice smoothed the way. River stones are smooth not because they started out that way, but because everything rough has been worn off them by years of moving water. She looked out the kitchen window. The man on horseback was broad across the chest and well dressed for the territory, good leather, a clean hat, a horse that cost more than most people's yearly wages. He was maybe 50, with a pale face and a close-clipped beard that was starting to go silver, and he sat his horse the way men sit horses when they want you to notice how comfortable they are, as if ownership of everything around him was his natural state, and he was merely waiting for the paperwork to catch up. She knew who it was before she heard Caleb say the name. Silas Crow. She could not hear the words. She watched Caleb's posture. Caleb stood with his feet planted and his thumbs in his belt, and did not move an inch, which was a kind of body language she had already learned to read. It meant he was not going to be moved. It also meant he was working hard not to show that being moved was a possibility. Crow talked. Caleb listened. At one point, Crow gestured toward the house, toward the kitchen window, toward where Martha was standing, and Caleb's head turned slightly, tracking the gesture. He turned back to Crow and said something short. Crow smiled. That was the part Martha would think about later. The smile. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man who believes that his patience is the same thing as inevitability. Crow turned his horse and rode back toward the road. Caleb stood in the yard for a moment after he was gone, not moving. Then he came inside. He didn't say anything immediately. He hung his hat. He poured himself a glass of water and stood at the sink drinking it. Martha kept stirring the pot. "Silas Crow," he finally said. "I figured." Caleb set the glass down. "He says he's heard concerns from town about the children being in the care of a woman nobody can vouch for. And he says he's thinking about writing a letter to the county about it." Caleb's voice was very level. "Out of concern for the children's welfare." "Of course," Martha said. "He's been wanting the water spring on the east pasture for 3 years. If he can force a custody review, create enough trouble." Caleb stopped. He pressed both hands flat on the kitchen table. "I should have seen this coming." "I heard men talking about it on Thursday," Martha said. "At the fence." Caleb looked at her sharply. "And you didn't say?" She turned to face him. "I was going to. I waited because I needed to understand what it meant before I said it." He looked at her. "What does it mean?" "It means he doesn't actually care about the children," Martha said. "He cares about the spring. The children are a reason, not a purpose. Which means if we take the reason away, if there's nothing to point to, no scandal, nothing that looks like neglect or impropriety, the letter he writes will have nothing real in it." Caleb stared at her. "That's—" He stopped. "He's counting on you being isolated," Martha said. "On nobody in town being willing to speak up for you. But Mrs. Foss came today, and Fenwick said something to his wife." She turned back to the stove. "You're not as alone as he thinks you are." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight in it, not empty but full. Full of recalculation. Full of something that was either hope or the closest thing to it that a man who'd had a hard year could manage. "You figure on this," Caleb said slowly. "On staying on, making it work, you figured on all of it." "I figured on the children needing care," Martha said. "The rest I'm working out as I go." She reached for the cornbread pan. "Supper's in 10 minutes. Call the children in." He called them in. The second week changed things. Not dramatically, not in the way of storms or arguments. In the way that weather changes when you're not watching. You wake up one morning and the light is different, and you realize the season has moved without consulting you. Ben started talking. Not a lot. Not in the way of a child who has suddenly recovered something he'd lost all at once in a rush. But in the measured, careful way of a boy who is testing whether his words are safe, whether they will be received or ignored or used against him, in some way he hasn't anticipated yet. He talked to Martha while she worked. He told her things about the ranch where the best eggs were hidden, which of the horses was skittish, and why what his mother had called the mountains on the far horizon on clear mornings. He talked about his mother more than any of the others did, and Martha realized it was because no one had let him. Annie managed grief through action. Grace expressed it through fear. Ben had been trying to talk about it for 6 months, and nobody around him could bear to hear it yet. Martha could hear it. She didn't offer comfort exactly. She didn't say things were going to be fine or that his mother was in a better place. or any of the things that adults say to children in grief that children do not believe and are not meant to believe. She just listened. She asked small questions that showed she was following. She let the silences be what they were. One evening, Ben came into the kitchen while she was reading by the lamp and said, "Do you think she can see us?" Martha looked up. He was standing in the doorway in his nightshirt, 6 years old, and entirely serious. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I think nobody knows for certain." He thought about this. "Annie says she can. Pa doesn't say anything. Grace is too little to think about it right." He rubbed his eye with one fist. "I want her to be able to see us, but I don't want her to see when I'm bad." "What do you do that's bad?" Martha asked. Ben considered. "Sometimes I don't want to share with Grace, and sometimes I'm mean to Annie in my head, I just don't say it." "Those are pretty regular things to do," Martha said. "But I don't want my mama to see them." "I think," Martha said carefully, "that if she can see she already knows you love Grace and Annie, that part is bigger than the mean thoughts." Ben stood in the doorway a moment longer. "Okay," he said. He turned to go. Then he stopped. "Maddie." "Yes. Are you going to leave?" He said it the way he might have asked about the weather plainly, with the kind of matter-of-fact tone that is not matter-of-fact at all. That is, in fact, the opposite of it. That is a 6-year-old boy trying very hard not to sound as scared as he is. Martha put down her book. "I'm here for the summer," she said. "That's what I agreed to." "But after—" "I don't know after," she said. "I'm not going to lie to you and tell you I know things I don't. But right now, tonight, I'm here." He looked at her. "That's enough," he said. He went to bed. Martha sat with her book in her lap and the lamp burning and the coyote calling somewhere in the dark, and she thought about what it meant to be enough. She had spent most of her life being told she was too much, too large, too heavy, too much space, taken up too much food, required too much of everything that the world preferred in smaller quantities. The idea that she could be at the same time exactly enough, not despite her size but regardless of it, because of what she did, and not what she looked like doing it, was not something she had a word for yet. She would have to think on that. The heat grew worse in the 3rd week. The creek dropped another 2 inches. Caleb started rotating the cattle between the east and west pastures, trying to keep them from working the same ground too hard. He came in at night with dust worked into every line of his face and his shirt dark with sweat, and he ate without much talking, and after supper he sat on the porch with his coffee and looked at the sky the way a man looks at a thing he can't control and is trying to make peace with. Martha began bringing him his coffee on the porch rather than leaving it on the table. She did not sit with him. That was not something she'd been invited to do. But she brought the coffee, and sometimes she stood on the porch for a moment looking at the same sky before going back inside. On the 4th night of this, he said without looking at her, "My wife used to sit out here." "I know," she said. "Annie told me." "You two have been talking." "Some." She held the screen door. "She's a good girl, sharp." "Too sharp sometimes." He cradled the mug. "She was 6 when she understood what the ranch was worth. 8 when she started listening to my conversations with the hands." He shook his head. "She shouldn't have had to grow up that fast." "She's growing back," Martha said. "A little." He looked at her. "She laughed today," Martha said. "Ben dropped an egg, and she laughed so hard she had to sit down. I haven't heard that from her since I got here." She paused. "I thought you should know." Caleb looked back at the sky. "Thank you," he said. It was the 2nd time he'd said it to her, and it carried more weight than the first. She went back inside. The trouble started on a Wednesday. It started quietly, the way trouble often does not, with a shout, but with a whisper, not with confrontation, but with the slow, patient poisoning of a well. Martha had gone to Dry Creek with Caleb for supplies. They took Annie with them because Annie had been asking to see Clara Hennessy, the school teacher, about her autumn lessons, and Caleb had said yes. It was the most ordinary thing imaginable, a man and his housekeeper and his daughter going to town for flour and salt, and a conversation about school. But Martha felt it the moment they turned onto Main Street. Eyes. Not all of them. Not even most of them. But enough. The particular quality of attention that means a conversation has already happened about you, and you are walking into its aftermath without knowing what was said. Two women near the milliner's. A man by the livery who said something to the man beside him. And then, coming out of the dry goods store, Mrs. Cora Aldridge, who Martha did not yet know by name, but would shortly a woman of maybe 45, with a face like a Sunday hat that someone has sat on, pulled to a particular shape of injury. "Mr. Rowan," Mrs. Aldridge said, positioning herself in a way that made passing her without stopping geometrically difficult. "I've been meaning to have a word." Caleb stopped. He put his hand briefly on Annie's shoulder. "Mrs. Aldridge, I'll be direct." She glanced at Martha. Through Martha, actually, the way certain people look at a pane of glass. "There are people in this town who are concerned about the arrangement out at your ranch. A woman of—" She paused. "Chose something. Of uncertain character, living in the house with your children." "Miss Whitaker's character is not uncertain to me," Caleb said. "Mr. Rowan?" Mrs. Aldridge lowered her voice, which managed to make it carry further. "You're a widower with 3 small children and a ranch to run. Nobody faults you for needing help, but there are standards." Her eyes moved to Martha again, that through not at look. "A woman like that living in a family home, it sends a message. You're a man of standing in this county. You have to consider how this looks." "A woman like what?" Annie said. Caleb's hand pressed down slightly on her shoulder. "Annie, a woman like what?" Annie repeated. She was 9 years old, and she was looking at Mrs. Aldridge with an expression that suggested she was already halfway to understanding every word the woman had not said, and she intended to have it stated plainly. "Maddie gets up before anyone, and she goes to sleep after everyone, and she cooks, and she washes, and she fixed the leak under the kitchen window, and she planted the garden back, and she let Grace sleep next to her when Grace was scared, and she taught Ben how to take care of the hens." Annie's voice was not raised. It was, if anything, quieter than before. "A woman like what, ma'am?" Mrs. Aldridge's face went through several expressions. "Annie," Caleb said quietly. "I'd like to know," Annie said. Mrs. Aldridge looked at Caleb with the expression of a woman whose plan has been complicated by a 9-year-old. "You should teach your daughter manners, Mr. Rowan." "My daughter asked a fair question," Caleb said. His voice had gone very flat. "I don't have a better answer for you than she does." He steered Annie around Mrs. Aldridge and continued down the street. Martha followed. She did not look at Mrs. Aldridge as she passed. She kept her eyes forward and her shoulders level, and she did not give the woman the satisfaction of a flinch. But she felt it, the old familiar burn of being talked about like furniture, like a problem to be solved, like a thing that occupied space without having earned the right to it. When they were out of earshot, Annie said, "She meant because you're fat." "Annie," Caleb said. "I'm not saying it mean," Annie said. "I'm saying that's what she meant. That's what they all mean. They think because Maddie's big that she doesn't have—" She stopped searching for the word. "Dignity," Martha said quietly. Annie looked up at her. "Yeah, that." "People decide things about you before they know you," Martha said. "It's been happening my whole life. It's ugly, but it's not new." She paused. "What matters is whether you know what you're worth, not whether they do." Annie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you know what you're worth?" Martha didn't answer immediately. She thought about Mrs. Hargrove, about the $1.50, about the seeds from Mrs. Foss's garden, planted now in dark soil, already beginning underground and invisible to decide to live. "I'm working on it," she said. The school teacher, Clara Hennessy, was a slender woman of about 35, with ink-stained fingers, and the direct gaze of someone who has spent years determining which children were telling the truth and which ones were hoping she couldn't tell. She met Martha for the first time in the doorway of the schoolhouse, while Annie was inside looking at the autumn curriculum, and she said without pleasantries, "You're the one who turned Annie back into a child." "Annie did that," Martha said. "You gave her room to do it." Hennessy looked at her with that assessing gaze. I've been watching that girl struggle for 6 months. She was running that house, running those children, trying to run her father's grief. She was 9 years old and carrying the whole thing. She paused. She came to me last week and asked about the autumn reading list because she wanted to read ahead over the summer. Not because someone told her to, because she wanted to. Martha was quiet. That's not nothing, Hennessy said. I want you to know someone in this town sees it. I appreciate that, Martha said. Hennessy looked past her toward the street, toward the direction of the dry goods store. I heard about Cora Aldridge. Word travels. Always has. Hennessy folded her arms. Silas Crow is behind it. You should know that. He's been in the saloon talking about Caleb's situation since last week, building a picture. She met Martha's eyes. He's going to move on it before summer's out. I don't know exactly what he's planning, but he'll use whatever's available, including you. I know, Martha said. And I'm going to do my job, Martha said. I'm going to take care of those children and keep that house running and work the garden and help Caleb keep the ranch together, and when Crow makes his move there'll be a record of what I actually did. She paused. Crow's plan depends on nobody seeing me clearly. I intend to be very visible. Hennessy looked at her for a long moment. Good, she said simply. That evening, back at the ranch, something happened that Martha had not planned for and would think about for a long time after. She was in the kitchen after supper washing the last of the dishes when she heard Caleb's voice from the front room low, telling some story to the children before bed. She couldn't hear all the words. She heard Grace laugh. She heard Ben ask a question. She heard Caleb's answer patient and measured the voice of a man who was not comfortable with comfort, but was learning to offer it again. And then she heard Annie's voice quiet, saying, Pa, is Maddie going to stay after summer? Silence. Martha stood at the sink and did not move. I don't know, Caleb said. Do you want her to? Another silence. Longer. Go on to bed, Caleb said. It's late. That's not an answer, Annie said. No, Caleb agreed. It's not. Martha heard the children go to their rooms. She heard Caleb's boots cross the floor. She heard the creak of the screen door as he went out to the porch. She finished the dishes. She dried her hands. She thought about this question Annie had asked and the answer Caleb had not given. She thought about the fact that he had not said no. She thought about the fact that she was not sure if that was hope or simply ambiguity, and she was not sure she was in any position to need it to be one or the other. She was here for the summer. She had said so to Ben. She had meant it as honesty, as the only honest thing she could offer to a boy who had been lied to by absence, by the sudden permanent absence of the person who should never have left. But the seeds were up now. 4 days after planting already an inch above the soil, the sweet peppers from Mrs. Foss, pushing up green and thin and improbably alive in the heat. Martha had checked them that morning, had pressed her thumb gently into the soil beside them to test the moisture, had pumped water from the rain barrel to give them just enough. It occurred to her that you didn't plant seeds for a summer. You planted seeds for what came after. She went out the back door and stood in the yard in the dark, looking at the garden that was no longer dead. Looking at the thin green lines of new plants against the dark soil. Listening to the coyote call and the horses shift in the barn, and the sound of Caleb on the porch moving the chair. The small sounds of a man sitting down alone. The way he had been sitting down alone for 6 months. She went around the side of the house. She stopped at the porch steps. I'll stay, she said. Caleb looked at her. He was holding his coffee. He had not poured it from the pot she'd left on the stove. He'd poured it while she wasn't looking, and he had been sitting out here with it since the children went to bed. After summer, she said. If you'll have me, if the arrangement works. She stopped. She had rehearsed nothing. She had not planned to say this tonight. I'm not saying it for it's not a... She stopped again, straightened. I'm good at this job, and those children need steadiness not just for the summer. Annie needs someone to let her be 9 for a while longer. Ben needs someone who'll listen. Grace needs... She stopped on Grace. I think you know what Grace needs. Caleb was looking at her. And what do you need? He said. She had not expected that question. She stood on the bottom porch step, with the heat still coming up from the ground, and the stars enormous overhead, and the coyote somewhere in the dark, and she tried to find a true answer. "Somewhere I'm worth something," she said finally. "Not because of what I look like, because of what I do." He was quiet. "That's not so much," he said. "It's everything," she said. He looked at his coffee. He looked at the dark beyond the porch rail. He was a man who had been doing his thinking sideways all his life, not avoiding it, just processing it in the slower, oblique way of people who don't have a lot of practice saying the thing directly. "I'll talk to the county clerk Monday," he said, "about making the arrangement official, a formal household position." He paused. "With proper wages and a contract." "That would be fine," Martha said. "It'd shut some of the gossip down, too." "That would also be fine." He looked at her for another moment. In the faint light from the window, she couldn't quite read his face. But his voice when he spoke again was different, quieter, less the voice of a man being practical. "I'm glad you saw that notice," he said. Martha stood on the step. "So am I," she said. She went back inside. She lay down on the bed with its quilt made of small flower-printed squares, and she listened to the house settle around her, to Grace's breathing through the thin wall, to the wind picking up outside, to the distant sound of cattle in the night pasture, to the creak of the porch boards as Caleb sat with his coffee in the dark. She thought $8 a month and a room and board. She thought a garden coming back. She thought Annie laughing so hard she had to sit down when Ben dropped the egg. She thought Mama Maddie. She put her arm over her eyes and she lay there in the heat, and she thought that she had spent so long being the thing people needed to move around the inconvenient size in the room, the woman who was too much and not enough simultaneously, that she had nearly missed what she actually was. She was the person who stayed. In the morning, Silas Crow's letter arrived at the county seat, but Martha didn't know that yet. What she knew in the dark of her room in the Rowan house was that the seeds were up and the children were sleeping. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she had fallen asleep before she finished counting the coins. The letter from the county seat arrived on a Thursday. Caleb brought it in from the road without saying anything, set it on the kitchen table, while Martha was feeding the children breakfast, and poured himself coffee with his back to the room. Annie looked at the envelope. She looked at her father's back. She looked at Martha. She was 9 years old, and she could read a room better than most adults, and what she read in that room made her put down her fork and push her eggs around her plate without eating them. Ben didn't notice. He was telling Grace about something he'd seen the oldest hen do near the water trough, and Grace was listening with the particular totality of a 4-year-old who has decided that everything being described is the most important thing that has ever happened. "Eat your breakfast," Martha said to no one in particular, and everyone at the table. After the children were out in the yard, Caleb sat down and opened the letter. Martha stood at the sink and waited. "It's from the county welfare officer," Caleb said. "A man named Harold Pruitt. He's been informed of a complaint regarding the welfare of 3 minor children at this address." He paused. He was reading, not reciting. "He will be visiting the ranch within the fortnight to assess conditions and speak with—" Another pause. "To speak with the children and any persons residing in the household." The word persons in this context meant one person. "Silas Crow," Martha said. "Has to be." Caleb set the letter down. He didn't slam it. He just set it down very flat, the way you set something down when what you want to do with it would not be useful. "I've got 2 weeks. "We've got 2 weeks, Martha said. He looked at her. "The children are mine to account for," he said, not unkindly, more like he was making sure she understood the weight of what was involved. "They're in my care too," she said. "I'm the one in the house with them most hours of the day. When Pruitt comes, he'll want to talk to me." She turned back to the dishes. "Let him." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "Crow is claiming neglect," he said, "and impropriety." Martha's hands went still in the wash water. "Impropriety," she said. "A single man, an unmarried woman, living in the same house." Caleb's voice was controlled in the way of a man who is controlling it deliberately. He knows that nothing is. He knows it isn't what he's saying. But he's saying it anyway. Martha looked out the kitchen window at the yard. She could see Ben crouched near the water trough, talking to the hen he'd been telling Grace about. Grace was sitting on the fence rail, supervised by Annie, who stood below her, with her arms up ready to catch which was the closest Annie got to hovering. "He needs the spring more than he needs to be right," Martha said. "That's the thing to keep clear. This isn't about me or about what I've done or haven't done. It's about water rights. Everything else is noise." "Noise that could lose me my children," Caleb said. That landed. Martha turned around. "Then we make sure it doesn't," she said. "We have 2 weeks. Let's use them." She dried her hands and sat down at the table across from him, and they talked for the next hour about everything that could be done. The contract, Caleb had already spoken to the county clerk about a formal household position, and she pushed him to move on that immediately, paper in hand, signed before the end of the week. References: Mrs. Foss Fenwick, Clara Hennessy, Evidence not of character, but of work, The Garden, The Children's Health, The State of the House. Things that could be seen. Pruitt will have already heard Crow's version, she said. He'll come here with that in his head. What we need is for him to see something that doesn't match the picture he's been given. Not a clean house. Anyone can clean a house for an inspection, but children who are clearly thriving, children who are easy and natural around me. Caleb looked at her. You've thought about this. Since the first day I heard his name, she said. He leaned back in his chair. He looked at the letter. He looked at Martha. He looked at the letter again. What else? He said. Tell Annie, Martha said. Not everything, not the worst of it, but tell her something is coming. She'll know anyway. She already knew the minute you walked in with that envelope. If you don't tell her, she'll make up something worse in her head, and then she'll try to manage it alone, and she'll be unbearable to be around for 2 weeks while she's doing it. Caleb almost smiled. That's accurate. She's your daughter, Martha said. He did smile then. It was the first full smile she'd seen from him. Not the partial acknowledgments, not the almost expressions, but an actual smile, small and reluctant, and completely real. All right, he said. He folded the letter. He put it in his shirt pocket. I'll talk to her tonight. He talked to Annie that evening on the porch. Martha was inside, but the window was open, and she heard enough. Annie listened without interrupting. That was not like her. Annie interrupted, constantly processing information out loud, making connections mid-sentence. The fact that she went quiet told Martha that the girl was taking it in seriously and filing it somewhere deep. Then Annie said, He wants the water spring. That's part of it, Caleb said. So it's not really about Maddie. Not really. But it'll hurt her. Caleb said something too low to hear. Pa. Annie's voice had that edge it got when she was being very careful. Is Maddie going to lose her job? Not if I can help it. That's not an answer either. I know, Caleb said. I'm working on making it one. A pause. You should tell her she's good, Annie said. You should tell her that she's good at this and that you want her to stay. Not because of the hearing. Because it's true, and she doesn't know you think so. Silence. Annie. She doesn't know Pa. She thinks she's here because nobody else would take the job. She doesn't know that you moved her good dishes to the better shelf because you wanted her to have the better ones. She doesn't know that you fixed the window latch in her room so it would open easier. She thinks those things just happened. Annie's voice was flat and certain. They didn't just happen. A very long silence from the porch. Go to bed, Caleb said quietly. You should tell her, Annie said, feet on the porch boards. The screen door opened and closed. Martha turned back to the counter and concentrated very hard on the bread she was covering for the overnight rise. She heard Caleb's chair creak on the porch, and then she heard nothing for a long time, and then she heard him come inside and go to his room, and she stood in the kitchen in the dark, with her hands on the damp cloth over the bread bowl, and thought about the better dishes on the shelf which she had noticed, and assumed was previous arrangement. And the window latch which opened so easily she'd been grateful and assumed was simply a good latch. She stood there for a while, then she went to bed. The next 10 days moved fast, fast in the way of days that have too much in them. Mornings that were already blazing by 7. Caleb out before dawn, with the hands trying to keep the cattle watered as the creek dropped Martha inside, managing the house and the children and the garden, which was coming up now in earnest, despite everything, the sweet peppers knee-high and the tomatoes climbing their stakes. The sunflowers along the fence already showing the first suggestion of yellow at the edges of their budding heads. Annie helped in the garden. This was new. She had avoided it before it had been her mother's garden, and there was a kind of grief territory around it that she hadn't been willing to enter. But on the Wednesday after the letter came, she came out in the morning with her old bonnet on and her sleeves rolled up, and she stood at the end of the first row and said, "What needs doing?" Martha looked at her. "Weeding," she said. "Between the pepper plants. You have to be careful not to pull up the plant with the weed, the roots are close." "I can tell the difference," Annie said. She could. She weeded the full row without pulling a single plant, and she did it fast. Her small hands moving through the soil with the sure instinct of a girl who had watched this garden worked before and retained everything she'd seen. They worked together in silence for a while. Then Annie said, "My mother's hands were small, like mine." "Were they?" Martha said. "She could do things with small hands that people said you needed big hands for." A pause. "Papa always said she could work a stuck latch loose faster than any man he'd known." Annie brushed the dirt from her fingers. "She was small. She wasn't big like you." Martha didn't say anything. "I'm not saying that bad," Annie said quickly. "I know," Martha said. "I'm saying—" Annie stopped. Started again. She couldn't have dragged Caleb's father's old wagon out of the mud last spring by herself. That took you and 2 men, but she did other things. She looked at her hands. "I think there are different kinds of strong." Martha looked at the girl. "I think you're right," she said. Annie nodded, as if that settled something she'd been working out for a while. She went back to weeding. Martha went back to the tomato stakes. Between them, the garden grew. On the Monday before Pruitt was due to arrive, Silas Crow came back. He came at midday this time, which was a deliberate choice. Midday was when Caleb was farthest from the house out on the east pasture with the hands. Crow knew the ranch's rhythms, which meant he had been watching it or had someone who was. Martha was hanging laundry when she heard the gate. She turned around. Crow was dismounting alone, which was either confidence or a calculated choice to not look threatening. He was in his good clothes again, that careful frontier respectability that was meant to communicate solidity and instead communicated effort. He looked at Martha standing between 2 lines of wet sheets with a clothespin in her hand, and he smiled the way he'd smiled at Caleb from the saddle patient inevitable. "Miss Whitaker," he said. "Mr. Crow," she said. She knew his name because Caleb had described him. She said it without inflection. He came a few steps closer. He looked around the yard, the garden, the repaired porch rail, the clean windows, with the expression of a man looking for something to criticize and finding the inventory disappointing. "Caleb's out," he said. "He'll be back at sundown. I'll be brief then." He stopped about 10 feet from her. "I want you to understand that my complaint to the county isn't personal. I have genuine concern for those children." "That's kind of you," Martha said. The flatness of her tone made him look at her more carefully. "I'm going to be plain with you," he said. "That'd be a change," she said. His eyes narrowed. He was not used to that. He was used to the conversation going a particular way. His version of plain, which was plain threat, wrapped in plain language, and women who worked as housekeepers in struggling ranches were generally expected to receive it with the appropriate anxiety. "Caleb's ranch is barely holding," Crow said. "The creek's down. The stock's down. He's going to have a hard year. Maybe 2. He paused. "I can make sure the county hearing goes well for him. I can write a letter to Pruitt saying I was satisfied after seeing the conditions personally. Withdraw the complaint." Another pause. "Or I can let it proceed." "And what does Caleb have to do for the first option?" Martha said. "Sell the East Spring rights, that's all." He made it sound like nothing. "A piece of paper. His family keeps everything else and this whole business goes away." Martha hung the sheet she was holding. She picked up the next one. "Mr. Crow," she said, "I am a housekeeper. I'm not party to Caleb's land dealings, and I'm not going to carry this message to him like it's an ordinary request. She clipped the sheet to the line. "But I'll tell you what I know about that spring. It's the best water on this property. The cattle would die in a summer like this without it. The garden would die. The children would be drinking from a dry creek by August." She turned and looked at him. "You know all of that. That's why you want it." He looked at her. "You're not what I expected either," he said. "People keep saying that," Martha said. "The woman Hargrove described—" "Mrs. Hargrove gave you $1.50 back on a $2 deposit," Martha said. "I wouldn't take her word on much." His face changed. Just slightly. The patience in it shifted towards something with less ease in it. "Pruitt's coming Thursday," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll be here." "That might not be in your interest," he said. "It's in the children's interest," she said. "That's the same thing." He stood in the yard for another moment. Then he turned and he mounted his horse, and he rode back out the gate without looking back. Martha stood with her hand on the line and watched him go, and thought good. Good that he'd come. Good that she knew exactly what he was. Good that he'd underestimated her to her face, because a man who underestimates you to your face shows you his whole hand while thinking he's showing you nothing. She finished the laundry. Then she went inside and wrote out in her careful schoolroom hand an account of the conversation, what he'd said, what she'd said, what he'd offered, and what condition he'd attached to it. She dated it, she signed it, she folded it, and put it in the envelope with the contract and the letter from Pruitt, and she put the envelope in the locked box under her bed. Evidence, not character. Work and the record of work, and now this. When Caleb came in at sundown, she told him everything. He read what she'd written. He was quiet for a long time. "He came while I was out on purpose," he said. "Yes." "He thought you'd be frightened." "He thought I'd be someone he could frighten," Martha said. "That's different." Caleb looked at her. "You're not frightened," he said. It was not quite a question. She thought about it honestly. "I'm frightened of you losing the spring. I'm frightened of the children losing their home. I'm frightened of doing this wrong." She paused. "I'm not frightened of Silas Crow." He set the paper down on the table. "Neither am I," he said. Wednesday night, the wind changed. Martha woke at 3 in the morning to the smell of something that shouldn't have been there. She lay still for a moment, trying to identify it. Not smoke exactly, not yet, but the dry, scorched smell that comes before smoke, the smell of heat concentrated in the wrong place. She got up. She went to the kitchen window and looked out. The sky to the east was wrong. It was July in Arizona territory, and the sky should have been black and star-heavy, which it was, except for the part of it near the horizon over the east pasture, which had a quality of orange to it that had nothing to do with dawn. Dawn was 4 hours away. She was already moving. She pulled her boots on over her nightdress. She grabbed her work apron because it was the heaviest fabric she had close to hand, and she already knew with the instinct of someone who had grown up in a place where summer fires were understood as a fact of life that she was going to need something between herself and heat. She went to Caleb's room and knocked hard twice. "Fire," she said. "East pasture. Now." She heard him move before she'd finished the second word. She went back to the kitchen and soaked the heaviest dish towels in the water bucket, wrung them slightly, and draped them over her arm. She went to Annie's room. Annie was already awake. She was sitting up with her eyes open, which told Martha she'd smelled it too. "Wake Ben up quietly," Martha said. "Don't frighten Grace. Bring all 3 of them to the kitchen and keep them there. Do not let them outside." "Is it bad?" Annie said. "Get your brother and sister," Martha said. She went outside. The fire had started in the dry grass at the far end of the east pasture. In the 4 hours since dark, it had moved. The summer had done its work on everything, the grass, the brush, the split-rail fencing along the pasture edge, and now the fire was doing its work on all of it methodically, without hurry, the way a dry summer fire burns when the wind is behind it. The cattle were in the pasture. Caleb was already at the barn when Martha came around the corner. He had a lantern in one hand and was pulling the horses out of their stalls with the other, moving with the focused speed of a man who has calculated the situation and is executing the only available plan. "How many hands are here?" Martha said. "Two sleeping in the bunkhouse, Roderigo and young Davis." He shoved a halter at her. "Take the roan. Get her to the front paddock." She took the halter. She ran the roan to the paddock and came back. Caleb was at the far stall. He had the gate half open when the horse, a young bay mare 6 years old and not yet easy with fear, smelled the smoke and went sideways. Her shoulder hit the gate. It swung back and hit Caleb across the shoulder and collarbone with the full weight of a panicked horse behind it. Martha heard him go down. She was through the barn door in 4 strides. Caleb was against the side wall. The mare was loose, circling the barn interior whites, showing around her eyes. He was on his feet barely with one hand pressed against his left shoulder and his face the color of old ash. "I'm all right," he said. "You are not," she said. She looked at his face at the way he was holding his arm. "Can you move the shoulder?" He moved it. The sound he made was not a scream, but it was in that direction. "Broken or dislocated," she said. "Dislocated," he said through his teeth. "Done it before." "Then it goes back in," she said. "Not now, after the horses are out." "I can. Tell me where to find Roderigo and Davis," she said. "Bunkhouse." She was already running. Roderigo was 40 with a bad knee and 20 years of ranch work behind him, and he was out of his bunk and pulling his boots on before she'd finished talking. Davis was 19 and had the particular quality of a young man who panics first and acts second, and Martha looked at him as he pulled his shirt on and said, "You're going to ring the church bell in town." "I'm not." "You take the road horse from the front paddock," she said. "You ride into Dry Creek and you ring that bell until people come out. Then you tell them there's a fire at Rowan's and you need men." She didn't wait for his answer. "Go." He went. She went back to the barn with Roderigo, and the two of them got the remaining horses out in under 3 minutes. Roderigo took the mare who trusted him and had her through the gate before the animal fully understood she'd been caught. The fire had moved again. She could see it clearly now across the pasture, the line of orange running along the fence, the smoke going up black against the star-dark sky. The cattle were bunched at the far end away from the fire, but far was becoming less far by the minute. "The gate," Roderigo said. "East gate, we open it, maybe they come out on their own." "Maybe," Martha said. "You go, I'll get water." She went to the well. She filled buckets. This was not firefighting in any heroic sense. She was not going to put out a pasture fire with a well bucket. But the gap between the pasture fence and the house had brush and old wood, along it dry wood. The kind of wood that would carry fire from one place to the other, like a letter delivered fast. She soaked it. She dragged the horse blankets from the barn and soaked those too. She worked the pump until her arms ached and her back ached, and the wet blankets she was slapping against the fence posts were too heavy to lift easily, and she lifted them anyway. And then she heard it. The sound of the barn roof settling in a way that roofs don't settle the particular crack and give of timber under heat stress. She turned. The corner of the barn nearest the east fence was lit. Caleb was already there. He had a wet blanket in his good arm, and he was beating at the base of the barn wall one-handed, his injured shoulder held slightly back from his body, and the fire was not going out, and he was not stopping. "Get back," Martha said. "There's leather in here," he said. "Tack. Everything." "Get back," she said again. She took the blanket from his good hand. She pushed him not gently away from the barn wall. He stumbled, caught himself, looked at her. She hit the fire with the blanket. She hit it again, and again. The smoke came up into her face, and she turned her head into her shoulder and kept hitting. The hem of her dress was steaming. She could feel the heat through the leather of her boots. She was not a small woman, and she was not a weak woman, and she had been doing heavy work in heavy summer heat for 6 weeks, and she was right now the most useful physical fact in this immediate situation. The fire at the barn wall went down. It did not go out the fence. Beyond, it was still burning, and sparks were coming in the wind, and one of those sparks was going to find the dry wood of the barn again in the next 2 minutes, but it went down far enough. "Wet sand," she said to Caleb. "From the creek bank." If we can pack it along the base of the fence." "I know," he said. They worked. His shoulder was wrong, and her arms were burning, and the smoke was everywhere, and they worked. Rodrigo came back from the east gate and took a shovel and worked beside them. The cattle had come through the open gate, not all of them but most, and were spreading across the road pasture, which was less efficient, but at least was not on fire. And then, from the distance from the direction of town, the sound of hoofbeats. Multiple horses. Men coming fast. Davis had done his job.
Betty.
The first men through the gate were strangers to Martha. She would learn their names later. The neighbor from the property, North the livery keeper, 2 cowboys who worked for a rancher 2 miles east. They came in ready to work, took in the situation in seconds, and started doing what needed doing without being told. This was the thing about fire in the territory: it didn't wait for introductions, and neither did the people who came out to fight it. Behind them came more men, and then on a fine horse with good leather came Silas Crow. He surveyed the yard from horseback. He looked at the fire at the fence line, which was dying now under the weight of 10 men with water and sand and wet blankets. He looked at the cattle in the road pasture. He looked at the barn, still standing. He looked at Caleb standing in the yard with his bad shoulder and his ash-blackened face. And then he looked at Martha. She was standing between what was left of the fence fire and the children. At some point in the last 20 minutes, Annie had come out of the house despite being told not to, with Ben behind her and Grace in her arms, and they had stopped at the porch corner, and Martha had moved to stand between them and the fire, without thinking about it, without deciding to. She was simply there, where she was needed. She was black with ash. Her dress was torn at the hem where the heat had taken it. Her arms were burned in 2 places, not badly, but burned the kind of burns that would blister in the morning. She was holding a wet blanket over one arm, and standing with her feet planted, and her back to the children, and her face toward everything that could still go wrong. Crow looked at her. For the first time, his face had nothing in it that she could call certainty. The patience was there. Men like Crow kept the patience close because it was the most useful tool they had, but underneath it, something had been disrupted. Something he'd planned around had not done what he'd planned. She had not run. She had not crumbled. She had not been the problem he'd expected her to be. She had been the solution. He looked away first. He dismounted and spoke to one of the men about the cattle, which was the practical thing to do, and also conveniently removed him from Martha's line of sight. She let him go. She turned to the children. Grace was crying, the silent, continuous kind of crying that exhausted children do when they're past the point of real distress and into simple overflow. Ben was not crying. He was standing very still and straight, with his hands at his sides, which was his way of being frightened. Annie was holding Grace and looking at Martha with an expression that Martha did not have a good word for, somewhere between fierce and frightened, and something more, something that 8 months ago would have gone soft and was now going strong. "Is the barn going to fall down?" Ben said. "No," Martha said. Pa's shoulder. "He'll be seen to." "You're burned," Annie said. "I know," Martha said. "I'll deal with it." "You went back," Annie said. Her voice had a quality to it that was new, lower, more direct. The voice not of a 9-year-old, but of whoever Annie was going to be in 10 years, speaking forward into the present. "You went back in when the barn caught. I saw you from the window." "The barn needed to not fall down," Martha said. "You could have." "The barn needed to not fall down," Martha said again gently but finally, and Annie understood the way she always understood and stopped arguing. Grace reached for Martha from Annie's arms. Martha took her. Grace put both arms around Martha's neck and her face against Martha's shoulder, against the burned skin which Martha breathed through without flinching, and she held on with the total commitment of a 4-year-old who has found the thing she needs and has no interest in letting go of it. "Mama Maddie," Grace said into Martha's shoulder. "Mama Maddie, Mama Maddie." Martha stood in the yard with ash in her hair and fire at her back, and the sounds of men working all around her, and she held that small child and did not say anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. When the fire was fully out and the men had done what men do at the end of emergencies, the checking, the assessing, the standing, in a loose group talking through what happened and what could have been worse, Silas Crow came to stand near Caleb at the paddock fence, Martha was close enough to hear. "Hell of a night," Crow said. Caleb said nothing. "I'll withdraw the complaint," Crow said. His voice was smooth, accommodating. "Given what's happened, no reason to add trouble to a man who's already had a hard night." "I want that in writing," Caleb said. A beat. "Of course," Crow said. "And I want it sent to Pruitt before Friday." "Caleb." "In writing," Caleb said. "Before Friday, or I'll be at that hearing with my own letter about this night and the offer you made to my housekeeper on Monday." He didn't raise his voice. "Are we clear?" The quiet between them was the kind of quiet that is not empty, but is the sound of one man recalculating in the presence of another man who has run out of patience for being managed. "We're clear," Crow said. He left. Caleb turned and found Martha standing 5 feet behind him. She hadn't meant to be that close. She'd come to tell him that his shoulder needed setting before the swelling got worse, and she'd walked into the end of that conversation without planning to. He looked at her. She looked at him. His face was exhausted and filthy with ash, and the lines around his eyes were deeper than they'd been this morning, and his shoulder was wrong, and he was still standing straight anyway, the way he always stood, the way that had nothing to do with pride, and everything to do with the habit of a man who has always had things depending on him. "Thank you," he said. It was the 3rd time. This time it meant something different. All 3 times had meant something, but this time in this yard, in this night, with the ash still in the air, and the horses restless in the paddock, and the children asleep finally in the house. This time it carried the weight of everything that couldn't be said between them yet, and was building toward being said anyway, as surely as the sunflowers along the fence were building toward opening. "Your shoulder," she said. "Come inside." She set it herself with Roderigo to hold, and a piece of leather for Caleb to bite on, and the sound he made when it went back was terrible, and then it was done, and she wrapped it and left him at the kitchen table with his coffee and his pain and his particular kind of stubbornness, and she went to check on the children. Grace was asleep in her own room for the first time in 2 weeks, flat out on her stomach, with her arms flung wide the way children sleep when they feel safe enough to be completely unguarded. Martha stood in the doorway. She looked at that small sleeping body, and she thought about the complaint still technically pending until Crow's letter arrived. She thought about Pruitt, who was coming Thursday regardless. She thought about the spring on the east pasture, which Crow had not gotten and now could not leverage, and the letter he would write before Friday. She thought about the garden which had survived the night, because the fire had not jumped the fence, which it had not jumped because she and Caleb and Roderigo had worked the gap line until there was nothing for it to jump to. She thought sometimes you don't win the thing cleanly. Sometimes you just hold the line until morning. She went to bed. The sun came up on a ranch that was still standing, and a spring that was still Caleb Rowan's, and 3 children who were still in their home, and a woman in a dusty blue dress, who was beginning to understand slowly, in the way that understanding comes when it has been a long time coming, that she had not arrived at this place by accident. She had arrived because this was where she was needed. The hearing was still 2 days away, but the fire was out. The morning after the fire, Martha's arms blistered. She had known they would. She'd known it the night before, standing in the yard with the wet blanket and the heat finding the skin of her forearms in 2 places where the fabric had ridden up. She'd noted it the way you note a thing that will need attention later, and then she'd set it aside because later was not yet, and there was still work to be done. Later was now. She wrapped both arms with clean cloth from her sewing kit before anyone else was up tight enough to protect the skin loose enough to keep working. She made breakfast. She fed the children. She told Annie when Annie noticed the wrappings and opened her mouth, "It's taken care of," in a tone that Annie, who understood tone better than most adults, recognized as final. Caleb noticed at the table. He looked at her arms and then at his coffee and didn't say anything, which she appreciated. He was managing his own pain. The shoulder was back in its socket, but the surrounding muscle was bruised deep, and he was holding his arm in the careful, deliberate way of a man who has decided that acknowledging discomfort is a luxury he doesn't have time for. They were both of them not entirely all right, and both of them were pretending otherwise for the same reason. The children needed the morning to be normal. The morning needed to be normal. Normal was the thing that kept the fear from the night before from setting up permanent residence in 3 small people who had already had enough of fear. So Martha made cornbread and Caleb poured coffee, and Ben told Grace about what the cow's face looked like when she came through the east gate in the dark, and Grace laughed, and the kitchen smelled like bread, and it was as close to normal as the morning had a right to be. After the children were settled with their chores, Caleb said, "Pruitt comes tomorrow." "I know," Martha said. "Crow said he'd write the letter." "Do you believe him?" Caleb set his mug down. "No, but I believe he's afraid of what I said about the offer he made you. A man who approaches another man's housekeeper alone and offers a deal that's not something a county official would look kindly on, and Crow knows it." He paused. "He'll write the letter." "But Pruitt still comes," Martha said. "But Pruitt still comes," Caleb agreed. She sat down across from him. This was not something she usually did. Sat at the table with him in the working part of the morning. She stood at the counter, or she moved, or she kept herself in the useful posture of a woman who is employed rather than settled. But today she sat down because what she needed to say required sitting. "Tell me what Pruitt will look at," she said. Caleb thought about it. "State of the house, children's condition, whether anyone's being harmed or neglected." He paused. "Whether the living arrangements are decent. Whether an unmarried woman living in the house is a moral problem," she said. "That's what Crow wants him to think." "And what will Pruitt actually think?" "Depends on the man," Caleb said. "Some of them are practical. They're looking for actual harm, not appearances. Some of them—" He stopped. "Some of them care about appearances," she said. "Yes." She looked at her hands on the table. "Then we give him nothing to misread," she said. "The house is clean, the children are healthy and clearly cared for. You have a formal contract with me you got that filed Wednesday morning before the fire," he said. "It's recorded at the county clerk." "Good. That matters. It makes this an employment arrangement, not a—" She stopped. Chose the word. "Not an irregular situation. It is an employment arrangement," Caleb said. She looked at him. "We both know what it is," she said. "I'm not saying it isn't. I'm saying what it looks like, and what it looks like is what Pruitt's going to see first." She paused. "I want to go over everything with you. What the children will say, what I'll say, what you'll say. Not to script it that reads false, but to know what the truth is and how to say it clearly." Caleb looked at her for a moment. "You've done this before," he said. "Not an accusation. Genuine. I've defended my right to be somewhere before." She said. "Yes." A beat of silence. Something moved across his face. Not pity, she was relieved to note. Something more like recognition. "All right," he said. "Let's go over it." Yet, they talked for 2 hours. In those 2 hours, Martha learned things about the ranch she hadn't known the full extent of the water rights dispute. The 3 letters Crow had written to the county in the past year about various alleged problems with the Rowan property. The fact that Pruitt had been out once before, 8 months ago, just after Caleb's wife died, and had written a report saying the children were at risk due to lack of adequate care. "8 months ago," Martha said. "Before I found reliable help," Caleb said. "And the children's condition then?" He was quiet. "Not good. Annie was doing everything. Ben wasn't eating properly. Grace—" He stopped. Grace had stopped talking for about 3 weeks. Martha sat with that. "She talks now," she said. "She does?" he said. It came out rough. "That's what Pruitt needs to see," Martha said. "Not a clean house, not a signed contract. Grace talking." Caleb rode into Dry Creek that afternoon. He went to see Fenwick and Mrs. Foss and Clara Hennessy. He did not ask them to lie. He asked them if they would be willing to speak to Pruitt if Pruitt chose to canvass the town, which county welfare officers sometimes did. He asked them to say what they knew, which was what they'd seen with their own eyes. All 3 said yes. He was back by sundown. He told Martha what each of them had said. Then he said, "Hennessy wants to come to the hearing. She said she'll speak formally if it comes to that." "It may come to that," Martha said. "She knows." He hung his hat. "She said—" He paused. "She said Annie came to her last week and asked about the autumn curriculum again, for the second time. She said the first time Annie had come 6 months ago, she was asking because she was worried about falling behind. Last week she was asking because she was excited. Martha turned back to the stove. She turned back so that Caleb wouldn't see her face, which was doing something she didn't have full control over. "Good," she said steadily. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Good." Harold Pruitt arrived Thursday morning on a rented horse from Dry Creek's livery, which told Martha that he was not a man who traveled with his own animal, which told her he came out to properties like this on assignment, and not from any agricultural background of his own. He was maybe 45, with a careful administrative face and the slightly dusty quality of a man who spent more of his life behind a desk than he spent outdoors. He introduced himself to Caleb at the gate. He had a leather satchel with papers in it. He shook Caleb's hand and said he was here to conduct a welfare assessment, as required by the complaint filed with the county, and he hoped they could make the process straightforward. "So do I," Caleb said. Pruitt came into the yard. He looked at the house. He looked at the garden. He looked at the repair work on the porch rail, and the clean windows, and the line of sunflowers beginning to open along the fence, still blooming, despite the fire's proximity to that side of the yard, because Martha had soaked those plants the hardest. He did not look at the burn marks on Martha's forearms, which were bandaged because he had not yet been introduced to Martha. Caleb introduced her at the kitchen door. "Miss Martha Whitaker," Caleb said. "She's been with us since June. I have the formal employment contract on file with the county clerk if you'd like to see a copy." Pruitt shook Martha's hand. He had the shake of a man who shook a lot of hands in the course of his work and had decided they were all the same. He looked at her the way he looked at the house, professionally gathering data, not committing. "Miss Whitaker," he said, "I'll want to speak with you separately, after I see the children." "Of course," Martha said. She had made lemonade. She set it on the table without being asked and went about the kitchen work, while Pruitt settled at the table with Caleb and opened his satchel and took out his papers. She did not listen. She worked, and the kitchen smelled like bread, and the children came in from the yard when Caleb called them, and she kept her back to the table and her hands busy. She heard Grace say very clearly, "Are you going to take us away?" She heard Pruitt pause. She heard him say carefully, "I'm just here to visit and make sure you're all doing well." "We're doing well," Grace said. "Mama Maddie made lemonade." A silence. "Did she?" Pruitt said. "She makes it with real lemons," Grace said. "We have a lemon tree out back. She fixed it. It was dying, and she fixed it." Martha kept her hands moving. Pruitt spoke with each child separately. He took them to the front room while Caleb waited in the kitchen, and Martha worked, and he talked to them in the careful, neutral voice of a man who was trained to ask questions without leading the answers. Annie was in there the longest, 12 minutes by Martha's count, which she was keeping without meaning to. When Annie came out, her chin was up and her arms were slightly folded, which meant she had said exactly what she'd meant to say, and was satisfied with it. She caught Martha's eye from across the kitchen, and gave one small definitive nod. Ben was in there 7 minutes. He came out looking thoughtful, which was his standard expression after any significant conversation. He sat at the table and resumed the picture he'd been drawing before Pruitt arrived methodically, as if there had been no interruption. Grace was in there 4 minutes. She came out at a run, crossed the kitchen, and wrapped herself around Martha's legs from behind. "I told him about the lemon tree," Grace announced from somewhere around Martha's knees. "I heard," Martha said, "and about how you let me sleep by the stove when I'm scared." And about how Annie laughed when Ben dropped the egg." "That's good information to have," Martha said. "He wrote it down," Grace said with satisfaction. Pruitt came to Martha last. He sat at the kitchen table with his papers and his careful face, and Martha sat across from him. And Caleb took the children outside, not because Pruitt had asked him to, but because Martha had looked at Caleb and Caleb had understood. She needed to do this part alone. Pruitt opened with the formal questions: her full name, her age, her place of origin, how long she had been employed at the Rowan Ranch, the terms of the arrangement. Martha answered each one directly and without elaboration. She had learned in various difficult rooms over the years that the instinct to over-explain was the instinct of the guilty. She was not guilty of anything, and she answered accordingly. Then Pruitt looked at his papers. A complaint was filed by a Mr. Silas Crow, he said, alleging that an unmarried woman of unknown character was residing in the home of a widowed man with minor children, creating conditions detrimental to the children's moral welfare. He looked up. I've received a letter this morning from Mr. Crow withdrawing the complaint. However, once a formal assessment is initiated, I'm required to complete it regardless. I understand, Martha said. So I'll ask you directly, Pruitt said. Is there anything in the nature of this arrangement that could be considered irregular or harmful to these children? Martha looked at him. No, she said. The children call you? He checked his notes. The youngest calls you Mama Maddie. She does, Martha said. That was her choice. I've never encouraged it. I've never corrected it. She paused. She's 4 years old, and she lost her mother 8 months ago. She needed someone to call something. I didn't think it was my place to take that from her. Pruitt wrote something. The children's physical condition, he said. When I last assessed this household 8 months ago, I noted concerns about nutritional adequacy and the older child's assumption of excessive domestic responsibility. I know, Martha said. He looked up. Caleb told me about your previous visit, she said, and about what you found. She folded her hands on the table. I'd like to tell you what I found when I arrived, if that's useful to you. He nodded. She told him. She told him about the kitchen, about Annie running the household at 9 years old, about Ben not eating, about Grace who had stopped talking for 3 weeks after her mother died and who this morning had followed a county welfare officer around a room telling him about a lemon tree. She told him quietly and without drama because the facts were dramatic enough on their own, and she had never found that volume helped. Pruitt wrote. He wrote for a long time. Then he said, Miss Whitaker, why did you take this position? She had expected all the other questions. She had not expected that one said in that way, not as a procedural inquiry, but as a genuine question from a man who was trying to understand something. She thought about it honestly. I needed work, she said. That's the truth. I had $11 in a carpet bag and a town that didn't want me, and I saw the notice on the platform post. She paused. But I've needed work before and not taken every job that was available. I took this one because... She stopped. Found the words. Because the other women left. Because I heard the way he talked about the children. Because a man who talks about his children that way, who says they're alive but barely living, who looks ashamed that he hasn't protected them well enough, that's a man who loves them. And children who are loved but not cared for need someone who will care. She met Pruitt's eyes. I can do that. Whatever else I'm not, I can do that. Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. He wrote something final in his notes. He closed the satchel. He stood up, and Martha stood with him, and he shook her hand again differently this time. Not the same as every other handshake. The shake of a man who has done his assessment and knows what he thinks. I'll have my report filed by end of next week, he said. I don't anticipate any recommendations for removal or intervention. Martha kept her face even. I appreciate that. The garden, he said at the door. Those are sunflowers along the fence. They are, she said. They were already in the ground. I just gave them water. He looked at them for a moment. My mother grew sunflowers, he said. It was the first personal thing he'd said since arriving. Then he put his hat on and went out to his rented horse and rode back toward Dry Creek. Martha stood in the doorway. She breathed. Then she sat down on the porch steps because her legs had decided that this was the moment to stop performing, and she didn't have enough left in her to argue with them. She sat there for maybe 2 minutes. Then Caleb came around the corner of the house with the children behind him. He stopped when he saw her on the steps. He looked at her face. Well, he said. He's not recommending intervention, she said. Annie made a sound, short, sharp, not quite a word. Ben looked at the ground and breathed out slowly. Grace, who did not fully understand what had been at stake, ran up the porch steps and sat down beside Martha and leaned against her arm. Caleb said nothing. He sat down on the step below her. Not beside her. Below her, which put them at the same height, and he looked out at the yard at the sunflowers, and he sat with his bad shoulder and his exhausted face, and the particular stillness of a man who has been carrying a weight for so long that the moment of setting it down feels more disorienting than the carrying did. "It's not over," Martha said quietly. "Crow withdrew the complaint, but he still wants the spring. He'll find another way." "I know," Caleb said, "but this part is done." "This part is done," he agreed. They sat on the steps in the heat, and the children sat around them, and the sunflowers moved in the small, dry wind, and nobody said anything for a while. It was enough. But it was not over. 3 days later, on a Sunday, Silas Crow stood up in church. The Dry Creek Church was the closest thing the territory had to a public forum, and Crow knew how to use a public forum. He let the service end. He let people stand and talk in the way people do after Sunday services, easy and social, the week's news moving from mouth to ear. And then when enough people were in one room and the moment was right, he raised his voice. He did not raise it dramatically. He raised it the way a man raises his voice at a town meeting, with the expectation of being heard, with the manner of a man who is speaking on behalf of others rather than himself. He said that he had withdrawn his formal complaint because he was a reasonable man and didn't like to cause hardship. But he said he remained concerned. He said that the county's standards for the welfare of minor children should not depend on one welfare officer's visit. He said that the community had a responsibility, a moral responsibility, to look after children in its midst who might be living in circumstances that reasonable people would question. And then he said her name. He said, "Martha Whitaker." He said, "Unknown origins." He said, "Large woman of no family, no standing." He said that a decent man like Caleb Rowan had been taken advantage of by a woman in a desperate situation who had inserted herself into a vulnerable family. He said this with the smooth, concerned voice of a man who was not saying anything inflammatory, who was merely asking questions, and the questions he was asking were the kind that leave marks regardless of the answers. Martha wasn't there. She heard about it that afternoon from Mrs. Foss, who arrived at the ranch with her husband driving the buggy, and her face set in the expression of a woman delivering news she is angry to be delivering. "He said it in church," Mrs. Foss said, "in front of 40 people. Martha was standing at the kitchen door. She was holding a dish towel. She was very still. "Caleb was there," she said. "He was there with Annie." Mrs. Foss's voice was clipped with anger. He stood up and said that everything Crow was saying was false, and that he would not have it said about a woman in his employ. But Crow... She stopped. Crow said something worse then. What Martha said. He said the question wasn't what Caleb thought. He said Caleb was a man who'd been alone too long and couldn't see his own situation clearly. Mrs. Foss met her eyes. He implied that you had that Caleb's judgment was compromised because of you. Martha stood very still. "Where is Caleb now?" she said. "Still in town. He asked me to come and..." But Martha was already untying her apron. Hey. She got to Dry Creek in 40 minutes on the road horse, which was faster than she'd ridden in years, and also given her arms more painful than she would have preferred. She didn't think about the pain. She thought about what she was going to say, and how she was going to say it, and whether she was going to be afraid when she stood in front of 40 people and said it. She was going to be afraid. That was fine. She had done hard things afraid before. Fear did not have to mean stopped. She found Caleb outside the church with Annie talking to Clara Hennessy and 2 other men she didn't know. He looked up when he heard the horse. He looked at her face. "Martha," he said. "Is Crow still inside?" she said. "Yes, but..." "Is there a meeting of any kind? Anything formal?" Hennessy said, "There's no formal proceeding. He just spoke. In the congregation." "Then I'd like to speak in the congregation," Martha said. She dismounted. She tied the horse. She looked at Caleb. "I need you to stay out here." He stared at her. "Absolutely not." "Caleb." She looked at him directly. "If you come in, it looks like you're defending me. If I go in alone, I'm defending myself." She paused. "Those are different things." He looked at her for a long moment. Annie said, "She's right, Pa." He looked at Annie. "She's right." Annie said again, flat and certain. Caleb took off his hat. He held it. He put it back on. "All right," he said. Martha went into the church. 40 people was an estimate. There were more than that. Some had stayed. Some had heard the noise and come back in. Some had never left. The room was full of the particular buzzing quality of a crowd that has just had something dropped in it and is still processing the ripples. Silas Crow was near the front, talking to two men. He looked up when the door opened. Martha walked to the center of the room. She did not go to the front. She did not stand at the pulpit, which would have been presumptuous and was not what she was after. She stood where everyone could see her in the aisle between the pews, and she waited until the buzzing died, which it did. Because a woman walking into a room like this alone, dressed in her working clothes with bandages on both arms and ash still faintly in the creases of her hands, was not something you talked over. She waited until it was quiet. Then she spoke. "My name is Martha Whitaker," she said. "I go by Maddie. I'm the housekeeper at the Rowan Ranch, which most of you know. I'd like to say a few things, and I'd appreciate it if you'd hear me out." Nobody spoke. "I came to Dry Creek 6 weeks ago with $11 and a carpet bag, and no references in this county," she said. "I took the Rowan job because it was the job that was there and because I believed I could do it." She paused. "I want to be clear about what I have and haven't done in that house. I have cooked and cleaned and tended. I have worked the garden, repaired what needed repairing, and kept the children fed through the worst of this summer heat. 3 nights ago, I helped fight a fire that came within a fence post of taking the barn. I have done nothing in that house that I would not do in front of any person in this room." She looked at Crow. He met her gaze. He had the patience still, but it was thinner now. "Mr. Crow has said things about me today that are meant to raise questions about my character," she said. "He has not said them because he is concerned about the children who are healthy and fed and in school and who, by the account of the county welfare officer who visited this week, are doing well." She kept her voice level. "He has said them because Caleb Rowan's East Spring is the best water source in this part of the county, and Mr. Crow has wanted it for 3 years. The children are a reason, not a purpose. I want you to know that." A murmur moved through the room. Cora Aldridge in the third pew said, "That's a serious accusation." "I know it is," Martha said. "I have a written account of the offer Mr. Crow made to me personally on the Rowan property on a Monday afternoon when Caleb was out on the east pasture. He offered to withdraw his complaint and write a favorable letter to the county welfare officer if Caleb would sign over the spring rights." She paused. "I wrote it down the same day, and it is in a locked box under my bed. I am happy to share it with anyone who would like to see it." The murmur changed quality. Crow said, "I'm not done," Martha said. He stopped. "I have heard what people say about me," she said, "about my size, about where I came from, about what I am and am not fit for." She let that sit. "I have been hearing those things my whole life. I'm not going to pretend they don't land because they do. But I want to ask you something." She looked around the room, not at Crow, not at Aldridge, but at the ordinary faces, the ones who had laughed a little, or looked away, or said nothing. "When those children needed someone, and 3 women before me walked away from that job because the house was too rough, and the children were too much, and the wages were too little. I stayed. When the fire came 3 nights ago, I didn't run. I stayed." Her voice was steady, completely steady. "I don't need this town to like me, but I will not stand outside while my character is discussed inside this building, and I will not allow the children I care for to lose their home because a man wants a water spring." She looked at Crow one more time. "That's all I have to say." She turned and walked back to the door. It opened before she reached it. Clara Hennessy walked in. Behind her was Caleb. Behind him was Roderigo, who had ridden in from the ranch without being asked, and was standing in the doorway in his good shirt with his hat in his hands. And behind Roderigo was Mrs. Foss and her husband, and the man from the property to the north who had come to fight the fire 3 nights ago, and whose name Martha would learn shortly was James Cooper. Hennessy walked to the front of the room. "I'd like to say something," she said. She said it clearly, and without drama, the way school teachers say things when they have decided to be the most reasonable person in the room. She said that Annie Rowan had been one of her students for 4 years. She said that 6 months ago, Annie Rowan had come to her looking like a child, who was running a household, carrying grief, managing adults, and forgetting to be 9. She said that last week Annie Rowan had come to her twice to ask about the autumn curriculum because she was excited about reading ahead. That is not the behavior of a neglected child, Hennessy said. That is the behavior of a child who has been given back her childhood. She looked at the room. By the woman who just stood in this aisle and said what she had to say. Mrs. Foss spoke next. She talked about the garden and the seeds she'd given, and what it meant that Martha had planted them in the worst heat of the summer. James Cooper said that when he'd come through the gate the night of the fire, the first thing he'd seen was a woman standing between the flames and 3 children. He said he'd been ranching for 20 years, and he'd seen fire do bad things to good people, and the woman he'd seen that night was not a woman who needed her character questioned. Roderigo said in his careful English that he had worked the Rowan property for 6 years, and that in 6 years he had not seen the horses as calm at night as they were now, and that horses knew things about houses that people sometimes didn't. And then, from the third pew, the woman with the dark bonnet, the one who had looked away when Martha walked out of the boarding house 6 weeks ago, the third of the 3 women who had been standing with Mrs. Hargrove, stood up. Her name, Martha would learn later, was Ruth Alcott. She said, "I saw this woman walked out of Hargrove's boarding house the morning she arrived in Dry Creek. I saw what Ida said to her. I saw how this woman carried herself when she walked out." She paused. "I didn't say anything that morning. I looked away. I've been thinking about that since." She sat down. That was all she said. It was enough. Crow said nothing. He stood near the front of the room with his smooth face and his patient manner, and he had no more argument, because every argument he'd had was now countered not by rhetoric, but by the people who had seen the actual evidence of Martha Whitaker's 6 weeks in this county. The minister, who had been standing at the side of the room since Martha walked in, looked at Crow and said quietly, "I think we've heard everything that needs hearing today, Silas." Crow put on his hat. He walked out. Outside in the afternoon heat, Martha was standing at the rail where she'd tied the road horse when Caleb came out behind her. She had heard everything from the doorway. She had stood there and listened to people she barely knew stand up in a church in the Arizona Territory and speak for her, which was something she had not had enough practice receiving to do gracefully. Her eyes were doing something she was not going to call crying, because she was standing in the main street of Dry Creek, and she had just established herself as a woman of character, and she was not going to undermine it by crying at a hitching rail. She was not entirely succeeding. Caleb came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything immediately. "The letter he wrote," he said. "The offer. You really wrote it all down." "Same day," she said. "Dated and signed." "You were already ready for this." "I was hoping not to need it," she said. He was quiet. "Martha," he said. She turned. He was looking at her with the expression she had seen developing for weeks in the early mornings on the porch, in the moment when he'd moved the better dishes to the shelf she used in the fixed window latch, in the way he'd said thank you 3 times and meant something different each time. The expression of a man who has been thinking something for a long time and has run out of time to keep it to himself. "I fixed the window latch in your room," he said. "And the dishes. I moved the dishes." "I know," she said. "Annie told me." He blinked. "Of course she did," he said. "She said you didn't want me to know they were deliberate." Martha said, "That you thought they would seem." She stopped. She wasn't sure what he had thought they would seem. She'd been afraid to think too closely about it. "I didn't know how to say what I meant," he said. "I'm not—" He stopped. "I'm not a man who says things easily." "I know that," she said. "But I think I need to say this one." Martha stood at the hitching rail in the afternoon heat with her burned arms and her road dust and her eyes that were still doing the thing she wasn't going to call crying, and she looked at Caleb Rowan, and she waited. "I don't want you to leave when summer's over," he said. "I don't want you to leave because of the children, and that's true. But it's not only because of the children." He held his hat in his hands, the same hat he'd tilted back on his head the first day she'd walked through his gate, the day she'd told him she wasn't fit for any man, but she could keep children alive. "It's because of you. Because you stayed when you didn't have to. Because you wrote things down and planted seeds and fought fires and walked into that church alone." He met her eyes. Because I haven't sat on my own porch and felt like I was sitting somewhere that was home in—" He stopped. "In a long time." Martha looked at him. The street was behind him. The church was behind her. Somewhere inside, people were talking, and the afternoon was moving on, and the road horse was patient at the rail, and the sunflowers back at the ranch were opening their faces to the same sun that was warming this street right now, the same sun that had burned her arms and dried the creek and scorched the pasture and been here every day of this hard summer without apology. "I'm not a small woman," she said, because she needed to say it, because it was the thing she had been told mattered more than anything else, and she needed to say it plainly in front of the man who was asking to matter to her in the same honest light that everything else had been said in. "I know what you are," Caleb said. "Tell me," she said. He looked at her. "You're the person who stays," he said. Martha stood in the afternoon heat and felt something she had not felt in so long. She had to find the word for it from far back, from a time before Hargrove, and before the $1.50, and before every room that had rearranged itself to account for her edges and her size, and the apology of her existence. She felt like herself. Not the version she apologized for. Not the version that walked carefully and took up as little space as possible and counted coins to get to sleep. The version that planted seeds in dead gardens and fixed what was broken and stayed when others left. Herself. "All right," she said. It wasn't yes, and they both knew it. It was the beginning of yes, which was more honest than yes would have been, because they were both people who took things seriously and knew that beginnings deserved to be named as what they were. He put his hat back on. She untied the horse. They rode back to the ranch together in the late afternoon, and the children were in the yard when they came through the gate, and Grace ran to meet them, shouting something about a chicken that had done something remarkable, and Ben was behind her trying to explain the chicken story with greater accuracy and less volume, and Annie stood on the porch with her arms folded watching them ride in, and when Caleb and Martha came through the gate together, Annie's arms unfolded. She smiled. Not the small, managed smile of a girl who was containing herself. The full, open smile of a 9-year-old who had gotten something right that she'd been working on for a long time. Martha saw it. She thought that's worth everything. The sun went down over the Arizona hills, the way it always did, without sentiment, without hurry, burning every color it had into the sky before it went. Martha stood on the porch and watched it, and Caleb stood beside her, and Grace held on to Martha's hand with her full fist the way she always did now. And the thing that was still broken in all of them, the grief, the long hard year, the summer's damage, was not fixed. It was not the kind of thing that fixed. It was the kind of thing that healed slowly, in the direction of the sun, the way the sunflowers along the fence turned their faces and kept turning. There was still work to do, but they were going to do it together. And that Martha thought watching the last of the light burn out over the hills was not a small thing. That was everything. The morning after the church, Martha woke before dawn and lay still for a moment in the dark, listening to the house. Grace was breathing steadily through the thin wall. Ben had made a sound in his sleep an hour ago. Not a nightmare sound, just the sound of a boy dreaming something vigorous, and had gone quiet again. Somewhere out past the barn, the horses were moving in the pre-dawn cool hooves, soft on the dry ground. The house was alive. That was the thing she kept noticing, and kept being surprised by noticing, as if she had to learn it new each time. 6 weeks ago, this house had been a thing that people survived in. Now, it was a thing people lived in. The difference was not dramatic. It was the difference between a fire that is only coals and a fire that has wood on it, the same thing changed by one steady, continuing act of attention. She got up, she dressed. She went to the kitchen and started the stove. She was halfway through the first batch of cornbread when she heard Caleb's boots in the hall. He came into the kitchen the way he always did, quietly, not announcing himself, as if he was still in the habit of not wanting to disturb whatever was happening in his own house. He poured himself coffee from the pot she'd already set on, and he sat down at the table, and for a while, neither of them said anything. This had become its own kind of language between them. The morning quiet, the coffee, the shared space of two people who had stopped needing to fill silence with words, because the silence itself had become comfortable. "Pruitt's report will be filed by end of week," Martha said, without turning from the stove. "I know. And Crow's letter. Already sent, Caleb said. Fenwick told me this morning Crow rode out to the county seat himself yesterday afternoon. Filed it directly. He paused. Whatever else he is, he's not a fool. He knows when a position is lost. Martha turned around. Is it lost? She said. Caleb looked at her steadily. The spring's safe. The children are safe. His complaint is withdrawn and on record as withdrawn. He held his mug. Yeah. That particular fight is done. She nodded. She turned back to the stove. Martha, he said. She waited. What I said yesterday, he said, outside the church. I remember what you said. I meant it. I know you did, she said. I believed you when you said it. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him thinking the particular quality of stillness that Caleb had when he was working something out like a man reading a document in his head before he spoke it aloud. I'd like to court you, he said. Properly, if you're willing. Martha stood at the stove with the cornbread pan in her hand. She had not expected that word. Not the idea she had been circling the idea for weeks both of them had, in the way of people who are aware of a thing and are being careful with it. But that word, properly. It was so precise, so deliberate. It was the word of a man who understood the difference between what he felt and what he owed, and who intended to make sure she received both. She set the pan down. She turned around. I'm willing, she said. He nodded. He looked at his coffee. He looked back up at her, and the expression on his face was not romantic exactly. Caleb? Rowan was not a romantic man in the flowery sense of the word, but it was open in a way that his face had not been open the morning she'd walked through his gate. Like a window that has been painted shut for a long time, and someone has finally worked the paint loose and pushed it up, and the air is coming through. All right, he said. He drank his coffee. She went back to the cornbread, and that was how it began. Not with declarations or grand gestures, but with a man who said properly and meant every letter of it, and a woman who had spent her whole life being told she was too much, and had finally in this kitchen in the Arizona territory found the place where she was exactly enough. The children knew before they were told. This was inevitable. Children who have been through hard things develop a particular radar for the emotional weather of the adults around them, and the Rowan children had been through one of the hardest things there was. Annie had known something was different the moment they'd ridden back through the gate together the previous evening. She hadn't said anything. Annie was learning slowly the difference between knowing a thing and needing to announce it, but she'd watched them at supper with the focused attention of a 9-year-old conducting an assessment. Ben noticed at breakfast. He looked at his father, and then at Martha, and then at his cornbread, and he said, "Are you going to get married?" The table went quiet. Grace looked up from her eggs. Caleb looked at Martha. Martha looked at Ben. That's a very direct question, she said. I'm a direct person, Ben said. He was 6. He said it with complete seriousness. We're getting to know each other better, Martha said. That's where we are. Ben considered this. But you already know each other. You can always know someone better, Martha said. Do you want to? Ben said. Get married. Ben, Caleb said. It's all right, Martha said. She looked at the boy. Yes, she said honestly. I think I do. But these things take time to do right, and your father and I are going to do them right. Ben looked at his father. Do you? He said. Caleb held his son's gaze for a moment. Yes, he said. Ben picked up his fork and went back to his eggs, as if the matter was entirely settled, and he had simply been confirming what he already knew. Grace said, Can I be in the wedding? Nobody's getting married yet. Annie said, with the lofty authority of a 9-year-old who has decided to be the reasonable one in the room. But when they do, Grace said. When we do, Martha said carefully, yes, you can be in it. Grace beamed. Annie, who was trying very hard to maintain her reasonable older sister expression, was not entirely succeeding. The corners of her mouth were doing something she clearly did not have full authority over. Martha caught her eye. Annie looked at her plate, but the corners of her mouth kept moving. The week that followed was the fullest week Martha had known at the ranch. Pruitt's report arrived on Friday, a formal letter to Caleb stating that after assessment, the county found no grounds for concern regarding the welfare of the Rowan children, and was closing the matter. The letter also noted in the careful language of official documents that the children appeared healthy, well-nourished, and emotionally stable, and that the household was being maintained to an adequate standard. Adequate, Martha thought. She appreciated that. Adequate was not flattery. It was a county welfare officer saying what he'd found without embellishment. And what he'd found was that the children were all right. The children were all right. She sat with that for a while. That same Friday, Clara Hennessy came out to the ranch for the first time, not on official business, but on a Saturday morning with a tin of shortbread and the comfortable manner of a woman who had decided to be a regular visitor. She sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee with Martha while Caleb worked the pasture, and she talked about the autumn curriculum, and about Dry Creek's school enrollment, which was growing, and about Annie, who she said was going to be someone remarkable. She already is, Martha said. I know, Hennessy said, but she's going to be remarkable in ways that require room. She needs adults around her who don't try to fit her into a smaller shape. She looked at Martha. You give her room. I try, Martha said. It's not common, Hennessy said. Women who make themselves small tend to make other women small too. It's not malicious. It's just what you know. She set down her cup. You didn't come here small. Martha thought about the $1.50, about Mrs. Hargrove's parlor, about the $11 in the carpet bag. I came here scared, she said. That's not the same thing, Hennessy said. No, Martha thought. It's not. On the second Saturday of August, something happened that nobody had planned and nobody could have predicted, and that changed the shape of everything after. Silas Crow came back. Not to the ranch. He didn't come to the ranch. He came to Fenwick's store on a Saturday morning when Dry Creek was full of ranchers and families doing their weekly errands, and he came with a man Martha had never seen before. A younger man, well-dressed with the particular quality of someone who has recently traveled a long distance and is trying not to show the fatigue. Word reached the ranch by mid-morning through young Davis, who had ridden back from town with the supply wagon and who was constitutionally incapable of sitting on information. It's a lawyer, Davis said. From Tucson. Crow brought him in. They were at the courthouse first thing. Caleb looked at Martha. What kind of lawyer? Martha said. Land lawyer, Davis said. That's what Fenwick said. Water rights specialist. The room went quiet. He's not done, Martha said. No, Caleb said. He was already thinking she could see it in the set of his shoulders, the specific stillness. The spring. He's changed his approach. If he can't use the children, he'll go directly at the land claim. Can he? Martha said. Is there a case? I don't know, Caleb said. The water rights have been registered since my father's time, but registered doesn't always mean uncontestable. He paused. I'd need a lawyer of my own to know for certain. Get one, Martha said. He looked at her. Today, she said. Write to Tucson today, or ride in Monday morning first thing. Don't wait for him to establish his position before you establish yours. That costs money, he said. So does losing the spring, she said. He held her gaze. The locked box, she said. The account I wrote of Crow's offer. Would that be useful to a land lawyer? It might be very useful, he said slowly. Then it's yours, she said. Use it. He was quiet for a moment. You'd testify to it, he said, in front of a judge if it came to that. I wrote it down the day it happened, she said. I signed it. I'll say in front of any judge in the territory what Silas Crow offered me on a Monday afternoon in your yard when you were out on the east pasture. She folded her arms. Let him deny it. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Martha Whitaker, he said, and the way he said it slowly with something in it that was not quite awe, but was in that direction, made her feel as she had felt standing outside the church, entirely like herself. Write the letter, she said. He wrote the letter. The lawyer from Tucson, a man named Edward Voss, who arrived 12 days later and turned out to be younger than his reputation, with sharp eyes and ink-stained fingers that reminded Martha of Hennessy read Martha's written account twice. He read Caleb's land registration documents. He read the original survey papers that Caleb's father had filed when the ranch was established. Then he said, "Crow's case is thinner than he's presenting it." Caleb said, "How thin?" "The spring is on land your father registered properly in 1861. The rights follow the land registration unless there's a prior claim, and there isn't one. I checked the county records going back 30 years. Voss set the papers down. What Crow's lawyer is arguing is a usage-based claim. That Crow's cattle have been using the spring water through your east fence for long enough that it constitutes a shared right. That's... Caleb stopped. "It's not nothing," Voss said. "It's not a strong claim, but it's not nothing. These cases have gone in stranger directions." He picked up Martha's account. "This, however, is something. If Crow approached your employee with a direct offer to withdraw a legal complaint in exchange for land rights, that's a different category of problem for him. That's coercion. A judge who sees this document sees a man who knew his legal claim was weak and tried to bypass the court entirely by pressuring a woman alone on your property. Can you use it?" Martha said. Voss looked at her. "I can use it to make Crow's lawyer very uncomfortable at the preliminary hearing," he said, "which may be enough. Men like Crow make calculations. If the calculation shifts, if the cost of this fight starts exceeding the potential value of the spring, he'll find a reason to walk away." "He doesn't walk away," Caleb said. "He will, if the alternative is a public record of what he tried to do," Voss said. He held up Martha's account. "This document makes that alternative very real." The preliminary hearing was set for the last week of August. The 10 days between Voss's arrival and the hearing date were the strangest 10 days Martha had spent at the ranch. Strange because everything on the surface was exactly the same as it had been all summer, and underneath it everything was moving. The garden was full now. The tomatoes had come in heavy, the peppers were fat and dark. The beans were climbing their stakes with the single-minded optimism of plants that have decided the summer is going to cooperate after all. The sunflowers along the fence were at their full height, every face turned toward the morning. The children moved through the days with the particular ease of children who have stopped waiting for something bad to happen. Grace had started sleeping through the night in her own room. Not every night, but most nights. And the nights she came to find Martha were the nights of hard wind or distant thunder, which was a different thing entirely from the bottomless fear of the early weeks. Ben had started talking to Caleb in the evenings, which had not happened much before. Sitting on the porch in the cooling dark, Ben would bring something out, a question about the horses, a thing he'd seen in the east pasture, something he'd been turning over in his mind, and Caleb would answer, and they would sit with it together, and Martha would hear this from the kitchen, and keep her hands moving, and let it be what it was. Annie came to her one afternoon while she was working the tomatoes and said, "I've been thinking about what you said in the church." "Which part?" Martha said. "The part about your whole life." Annie said, "Hearing things about your size, your whole life." She crouched down beside Martha and started checking the tomato stakes. "How do you not—" She stopped. "How do you not let it make you small?" Martha looked at her. "Some days I do," she said. "I don't want to lie to you. Some days I carry everything they've said, and I move smaller because of it." She pulled a weed from between the plants. "But then I look at what my hands have done. What I've built. What I've fixed. What I've kept alive." She looked at the garden around them. "And I think those things are real. They happened. Nobody's opinion of my size changes the fact that this garden is growing." Annie was quiet, her hands in the dirt. "What if people keep saying things?" she said. "They will," Martha said. "People who need others to be small don't stop because you ask them to. They stop because you stop shrinking." She paused. "Or they don't stop and you stop caring, which is different from shrinking and harder to achieve but possible." Annie sat back on her heels. "Are you going to keep getting bigger?" she said. And then seeing Martha's expression, she said quickly, I mean braver. Are you going to keep getting braver?" Martha looked at this 9-year-old girl who was asking a question that she had probably been asking about herself in different words for the better part of a year. "Yes," Martha said. Me too, Annie said. They worked the rest of the tomatoes together. The night before the hearing, Caleb came to find Martha on the back porch. She was sitting in the dark with her hands in her lap, doing the thing she sometimes did in the evenings, not thinking exactly, but letting the day settle. He came out and sat in the other chair, and for a while they were quiet. "Voss thinks it'll go quickly," Caleb said. "That's good," she said. "If Crow's lawyer sees the document, he thinks they'll move to settle, something formal registered. Crow keeps usage rights for the cattle he already runs to the spring. Rowan keeps ownership and control." He paused. "It's not everything, but it ends it. Will you take that?" He thought about it honestly. "Probably," he said. "A fight I can end is better than a fight I keep having. I've got a ranch to run." She nodded. "Martha," he said. She looked at him. He was quiet for a moment, in the specific way he had when he was working up to something, not hesitating exactly, but being careful with it, the way you're careful with something that matters. "After the hearing," he said, "when this is settled, I'd like to ask you something." She held herself very still. "What kind of something?" she said. "The kind that requires an answer," he said. "And I'd like the answer to be something you've thought about, and not just said, because the moment was because of the feeling of it." He looked at her directly. "I don't want you to say yes because the summer was hard, and we came through it together, and it feels like the natural next thing. I want you to say yes because you want this." He paused. "This life, this land, these children, me." Martha looked at him. The stars above the Arizona Territory were enormous and indifferent and completely beautiful, and the coyote was calling somewhere in the dark, the way it had been calling every night since she arrived, and the house behind her was breathing with 3 sleeping children, and she was sitting in a chair on a back porch of a ranch she had arrived at with $11 and a carpet bag and no references in this county. "I've already thought about it," she said. And I want it," she said. "All of it. The way you said it in that order." She paused. "The land and the children and you." He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand. His hand was calloused and large, and it held hers with the same quality that everything Caleb Rowan did had: no performance, no excess. Just the thing itself done fully and with attention. They sat on the back porch in the dark and the heat and held hands like two people who have been through a summer's worth of fire and come out the other side and found each other standing in the ash, and that was enough, and it was everything. The hearing took 40 minutes. Voss presented the land registration. He presented the survey documents. He presented Martha's written account of Crow's offer, which he handed to the judge, a quiet man named Alderton, who had been on the circuit for 15 years, and had seen most of what there was to see in the Arizona Territory, without comment because it didn't need one. Crow's lawyer saw the document. He asked for a recess. The recess lasted 20 minutes. When they came back, Crow's lawyer proposed exactly what Voss had predicted: a formal registered agreement granting limited cattle usage rights to the Crow property in exchange for the permanent withdrawal of all claims and complaints regarding the Rowan land and the Rowan household. Caleb looked at Martha, who was sitting in the row behind him. She nodded once. He signed. Crow signed without looking at him. The judge registered the agreement. It was done. Outside the courthouse in the August heat, Voss shook Caleb's hand and said the paperwork would be finalized within the week. He shook Martha's hand and said that her document had been the decisive factor, and she said she was glad she'd written it down, and he said he'd seen a lot of people wish they had, and that was the end of that. Crow came down the courthouse steps behind them. He stopped when he saw Martha. She turned and looked at him. He had his patience still. Men like Crow always kept the patience, because it was the foundation of how they operated, the belief that time was on their side, that what they wanted would eventually be available if they were willing to wait long enough. He still had it, but it was different now, thinner like fabric that has been washed too many times. "Miss Whitaker," he said. "Mr. Crow," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face. Not remorse. She didn't think Crow was built for remorse, but something that might have been in a different man recognition. "You're not what I expected," he said. "I know," she said. "People keep saying that." He put his hat on and walked to his horse and rode out of Dry Creek without looking back. Martha watched him go. She thought good. And then she turned toward Caleb, and they walked to the wagon, and they went home. Chapitre. They were married on the first Saturday of October. Caleb had asked her on the porch the evening after the hearing in the same quiet way he'd said everything that mattered. Not on his knee, not with ceremony. Just the two of them in the cooling dark with the coyote calling and the stars doing their enormous indifferent work overhead. He said, "Will you marry me, Martha Whitaker?" She said, "Yes, Caleb Rowan, I will." That was it. That was the whole of it. And it was enough, and neither of them needed it to be more. The wedding was at the Dry Creek Church, which Martha found appropriate in a way she did not say aloud. The same church where Crow had tried to end her, the same room where she had stood in the aisle and said her piece. It seemed right that the room should be used for this too, that it should hold both things. Mrs. Foss made 2 pies and a cake. Hennessy sat in the front pew with the kind of satisfaction that a person has when they have backed a thing and the thing has come through. Fenwick came with his wife. Roderigo stood in the back with his hat in his hands and his good shirt on. James Cooper came with his family from the North property. Ruth Alcott, the woman who had looked away the morning Martha walked out of the boarding house and had stopped looking away in the church, sat near the middle with her husband and said nothing during the service and wiped her eyes twice. The children stood at the front. Grace was in a white dress that Martha had made from fabric she'd ordered from Tucson 3 weeks earlier. White cotton with small blue flowers at the collar, a detail she'd put in because she knew Grace would want to tell people about it. Grace stood very straight and held her flowers with both hands and beamed at everyone with the uncomplicated joy of a 4-year-old for whom everything was going exactly right. Ben stood beside her in his good shirt, which Martha had pressed that morning, while he stood patiently beside her, and he held his posture with the careful dignity he brought to everything. Annie stood on Martha's other side, not as a flower girl, not as a small prop in someone else's ceremony. She stood there because Martha had asked her to stand there because she'd said, "I'd like you beside me if you're willing." And Annie had said without any of her usual layering of qualification or assessment, "Yes." And that was that. Just before the minister began, Annie leaned slightly toward Martha and said quietly, "She would have liked you." Martha looked at her. "My mother," Annie said. "She would have liked you. She liked people who did things." She was looking at the front of the church. Her voice was careful and even. "I thought you should know that." Martha looked at this fierce, particular, complicated girl who had run a household at 9 years old and was slowly, carefully learning to put that weight down. Who had weeded an entire garden row because she remembered how her mother's hands moved. Who had stood on a courthouse step and told Martha she was right, Pa, in a voice that was entirely her own. "Thank you," Martha said. It was the most important thank you she'd said in the whole summer. The minister began. 6 months later, the ranch looked like a different place. The autumn had been kinder than summer, the rain coming in September and October, and filling the creek back up to something reasonable, the cattle putting weight back on the garden, giving one last round of tomatoes before the cool took it. Caleb hired a second hand for the winter work and paid him a fair wage, which was possible because the Crow dispute was resolved and the legal fees were done and the ranch was solvent in the way that hard-working places become solvent when the disasters stop compounding. Martha was not a different woman. She was more fully the woman she had always been, which is not the same thing, but is better. She still got up before dawn. She still made the cornbread. She still pressed her thumb into the garden soil to test the moisture. Still pulled weeds between the seedlings, still moved through the house, doing the 1,000 small acts of maintenance that kept a living place living. She still had the carpetbag under the bed. She had not unpacked it entirely, because the habit of readiness was too old to fully abandon, and she did not think it was a flaw. She just thought it was a fact. But she also moved differently, not because anyone had told her to, not because anyone had given her permission, because something that had been tight in her for a long time had loosened, and the loosening had happened so gradually that she had not noticed it happening. Until one morning, she looked in the small mirror above the washstand and looked at herself. Really looked, not the quick, functional look of a woman confirming her hair was pinned and moving on, but looked, and she did not look away. She looked at the woman in the mirror. The chestnut hair that was always slightly escaping whatever she pinned it with. The strong hands. The soft face. The arms that had burned in a fire and healed and carried weight and planted seeds and held a 4-year-old who needed holding. The body that was large and solid and entirely her own, that had hauled water and set a dislocated shoulder and stood in an aisle in front of 40 people and said what needed to be said. She looked at all of it. She thought, this is who I am. She thought she is enough. And then she went to make breakfast because the children were waking up and Caleb was already out at the barn, and the morning needed doing, and she was the woman who did it. On the first clear morning of spring, Martha was in the garden when Annie came and crouched beside her. "The sunflowers are coming back," Annie said. They were. The first green shoots along the fence, the ones from the seeds Martha had saved the day she'd cleaned out the dead garden, the ones she'd pressed into the soil in the worst heat of summer. Coming up. "I knew they would," Martha said. "How?" Martha sat back on her heels. She thought about how to answer. She thought about the seeds in her hand, dry and light, pressed out of the empty seed heads along the fence. About the way the garden had looked when she arrived, dead, desiccated, given up. About the way she'd turned the soil anyway, and added the compost and planted the seeds Mrs. Foss had given her, and watered them through the fire, and the hearing, and the wedding, and the winter. Because they were already in the ground, she said. They just needed someone to keep showing up. Annie looked at the shoots for a moment. Then she said, "That's what you did. For us." Martha looked at her. Annie was not a girl who said soft things easily. She said true things which were sometimes soft and sometimes not. This was both. "Yes," Martha said. "I suppose it is. I suppose it—" They worked the garden together in the early spring morning, the two of them in the good quiet of people who have been through something and are now on the other side of it, and the house was warm behind them. And inside it, Grace was telling Ben something important about a chicken, and Caleb's voice came from the barn, low and steady, talking to the horses, the way he talked to everyone he cared about, without excess, without performance, just the plain and durable fact of his attention. Martha pressed her hands into the dark soil. She was not the woman who had walked out of Hargrove's boarding house with $1.50 and $11, and her shame carried in front of her like a shield. She was not the woman who had counted coins to fall asleep. She was Martha Rowan now. She was the woman who stayed. She was the woman who had arrived in Dry Creek, Arizona territory, with nothing the world considered valuable, and had looked at a broken family and a dead garden, and a man who didn't know how to ask for what he needed, and had simply, without ceremony, without guarantee, without any promise of return, begun. And the world had tried to make her small, and the summer had tried to burn her out, and Silas Crow had tried to use her against the people she had come to love, and all of it had failed. Because some women are not too big to be loved. Some women are big enough to hold a broken family together, to stand between the fire and the children, to speak in a room full of people who have already decided what she is, to plant seeds in dead soil in the middle of the worst summer in years, and believe without proof that they will come up. Some women are exactly the right size for the life that was waiting for them. And Martha Whitaker. Rowan, kneeling in her garden in the Arizona spring with the sunflowers coming up along the fence and her family alive inside the house behind her, understood at last and completely and without apology that she had always been one of them. She had just needed to find the place where she was allowed to be it. She had found it, and she was never for a single day of the rest of her life going to give it back.